At first, nothing looks dramatic enough to change the human story. No mountain splits open, no sea rushes over a city, no black cloud covers the sun. The land still lies where it always lies. Rivers continue to bend through valleys. Herds still cross open ground. Wind still moves through grass, through thorn scrub, through stands of thin trees. Dawn still arrives in pale light, and evening still lowers the temperature over campfires and skin and stone. If someone stands on a ridge and looks out over the familiar distance, the world appears intact. That is what makes the change so powerful. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive as a single catastrophe that forces every eye toward it. It moves too slowly for panic, too quietly for legend at first. And yet it enters human life so deeply that in time almost every habit begins to lean around it. A band of people wakes before sunrise near a water source that has always been reliable enough to trust, though not quite as reliable as their grandparents remember. There is no word for this difference. There is only experience. The ground around the edge of the pool cracks a little earlier in the season. The animals come at slightly stranger hours. A stand of edible plants farther along the slope is thinner than it used to be. None of this looks like a turning point. None of it feels like the opening of a new age. It feels like inconvenience, like bad luck, like one of those stubborn years the world sometimes produces. So they adjust, they walk farther, they wait longer, they watch the sky more carefully, they argue less about what should happen, and more about when to move. They begin without noticing to become slightly different people. That is the mystery at the center of this story. Human beings are very good at seeing danger when it is immediate. Teeth in the dark are easy to understand. A rival group near a hunting ground is easy to understand. A storm rolling in from the horizon is easy to understand. But the most decisive change in human life may not have looked like danger at all. It may have looked like variation. A few dry seasons, a few cold ones, a shift in where the animals graze, a coastline that does not sit exactly where memory expects it to be, a fruiting season that arrives early then late, then uncertain. Each sign is small enough to explain away. Together they begin to reorganize attention itself. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The old human world, if it can be called old, is never simple, never peaceful, in the sentimental way later people imagine. It is hard, exposed, hungry, full of risk, but it is patterned. Survival depends not just on strength or daring, but on rhythm. There is a time to move and a time to stay, a time to search the river margin and a time to climb toward open ground, a time when certain animals can be tracked and a time when it is wiser to leave them alone. Knowledge is not abstract. It is fitted tightly to place. It lives in roots, seasons, smells, landmarks, wounds, remembered, shelters, remembered failures, remembered places where someone once found water in a season that should have offered none. Human life is already intelligent, already adaptive, already social on a remarkable level. But it is adapted to a world whose patterns remain just stable enough to be learned. Then stability begins to loosen. No single person can stand outside the span of generations and say what is happening. That is one of the cruelest features of gradual transformation. Each generation inherits a world that feels normal because it is the world encountered in childhood. People compare the present not to ancient baselines but to living memory. And living memory is short. If a marsh shrinks over 3 or 4 generations, no one experiences the full loss in one life. If a coastline shifts, if a grassland dries, if winters sharpen or summers lengthen, these changes are absorbed in fragments. People do not say the world has fundamentally changed. They say the old route is less dependable. They say the animals did not come this year. They say another valley might be better. They say elders remember things that no longer happen. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives in the record suggests that many of the most important transitions in prehistory were lived this way not as grand revelations, but as accumulations of inconvenience. That accumulation matters because humans do not simply endure environments, they build behavior around them. If the world becomes slightly less predictable, then prediction becomes more valuable. If food becomes patchier, then sharing becomes more strategic. If movement becomes riskier, then information becomes a resource with almost the same weight as meat or water. A hidden change in the background conditions of life does not stay in the background for long. It reaches into camp structure, into parenting, into memory, into trust, into who is listened to, into which places become sacred or feared, into how long people stay, into how much they carry into what they notice, into what they teach children to notice. The astonishing part is that none of this requires a dramatic invention to begin. No king decrees it, no priest names it, no city records it. It may begin in a deeper human past than writing beyond agriculture, beyond monuments, beyond anything that leaves behind a neat explanation. Archaeology gives glimpses rather than speeches. Pollen shifts in ancient sediments. Animal bones appear in different combinations. Isotopes preserve traces of changing diet and movement. Stone tools suggest different tasks repeated across longer spans. Hearths appear in places where returning matters. Shorelines preserved in geology hint at lands now drowned and roots now broken. Scholars still debate the weight of each piece of evidence, but together they point toward a world in motion and toward people who are not merely following that motion, but being reshaped by it. Imagine living close enough to the land that every small irregularity matters, but too close to it to see the pattern from above. That is the human condition for most of our history. The world is not scenery, it is instruction. It tells people where to go, what to eat, how long to stay, whom to fear, when to conserve energy, when to gamble, when to turn back. Now imagine that the instruction begins changing not all at once, but with just enough force to make old habits less efficient. This is where the unnoticed revolution begins. Not in the landscape alone, but in the tension between remembered success and present uncertainty. Some groups would have felt this tension in drying corridors where waterholes became farther apart. Others along coasts where sea levels moved and rich shorelines appeared, vanished or shifted beyond recognition. Others on open grasslands where prey changed migration timing by days, then weeks, then entire routes. Others near wooded edges where the balance between forest and open ground tilted, changing what could be gathered and what could be hunted. Human beings did not all experience the same hidden change in the same place or on the same schedule. That would be too tidy. But across long stretches of time, many populations confronted a similar truth. The old map in the mind no longer matched the ground as cleanly as it once had. When that happens, a species does not merely travel differently. It thinks differently. Not instantly, not magically, not in some exaggerated leap that turns one kind of human into another overnight. The process is subtler than that. A little more caution here, a little more planning there, a stronger habit of remembering which slope holds shade longer into the dry season, a stronger interest in who knows distant terrain, a deeper dependence on those who can read signs that others miss. One lesser-known detail from ethnographic comparison and archaeological inference is how often survival in variable landscapes depends not on raw abundance, but on timing. Being in the wrong place a week too early can be as dangerous as being in the wrong place entirely. That makes temporal knowledge, knowing when, not just where, profoundly important. And once timing becomes central, attention changes, patience changes, teaching changes, perhaps even the inner experience of waiting changes. The human story is often told through obvious thresholds: the first tools, the first art, the first burials, the first farms, the first cities. These are useful markers, but they can hide the deeper continuity underneath. Before humans raise walls or write myths about flood and famine, they are already being trained by a restless world. Their nervous system, social habits, and practical intelligence are being pressured into new shapes by a problem that does not look like a problem all at once. The one thing they never fully noticed may not have been a single object or force at all, but the gradual loss of environmental certainty. Once that certainty begins to fray, everything built on top of it starts to shift as well. There is something almost unnerving in that thought. Human beings like causes they can point to: a volcano, a drought, an invasion, a disease. Those belong to the scale of story. But some of history's greatest turning points may belong to a quieter scale, one so quiet that the people inside it mistake transformation for ordinary life. They wake, gather, move, eat, teach, protect children, bury their dead, and make small decisions that feel practical and temporary. Those decisions repeat. Then they accumulate. Then they become custom. Then they become expectation. Eventually they become human nature, or something close enough to be mistaken for it. And because the change is gradual, it hides inside success. A group survives a harder season because it's stored more, remembered, better, shared differently, or moved sooner. No one says we're becoming a new kind of social creature. They simply survive. Another group clings longer to an older rhythm and pays for it in hunger, conflict, fragmentation, or disappearance. Prehistory is full of these silent siftings. The record rarely preserves failure with dignity. Often it leaves only absences, a tool tradition that fades, a route no longer used, bones no longer found where they once appeared, a settlement pattern interrupted, a species pushed away, a people dispersed. No single explanation fully accounts for all these shifts because the hidden change works through local conditions as much as global ones. But the direction of pressure is unmistakable. Humans are being asked again and again to live with uncertainty. That demand may seem ordinary now because uncertainty is the native air of modern life too. But someone had to become good at it first. Someone had to become more patient with incomplete information, more dependent on shared memory, more alert to weak signals, more willing to invest effort now for a result later. Someone had to become more human in the specific way we recognize today, not just reactive but anticipatory, not just clever but organized around future risk. The landscapes of deep history may have taught that lesson slowly, harshly, and without ever naming it. So the story begins not with a monument rising from the earth, but with a mismatch so slight it is almost invisible. The path still exists, but the water at the end of it is lower. The herd still arrives, but thinner later, harder to corner. The grove still stands, but no longer produces enough to trust. The shore still gleams in morning light, but it no longer lies where the oldest stories place it. Human beings step into this altered world still believing at first that they are dealing with exceptions. They do not yet understand that the exceptions are becoming the rule, and once that happens, the old world does not end in a single blow. It starts bending quietly until human behavior bends with it. For a very long time, the world still seems teachable. That is what holds the older human order together. A child grows up inside movement that appears to have shape and repetition. The adults around them do not possess certainty in any absolute sense, because no foraging life is ever free from surprise, but they do possess confidence earned by return. The same ridgeline leads toward known grazing land. The same valley holds shade late into the hot months. The same bend in a river offers fish when water is high and exposed crossings when it falls. Certain plants can be gathered after particular winds. Certain animals leave tracks in soft ground at a familiar point in the year. The horizon is not abstract space. It is layered memory, and that memory is practical enough to keep people alive. The older world is built from this confidence in rhythm. Human groups do not wander randomly through empty wilderness, as older fantasies once imagined. They move through dense maps of meaning. A stand of trees is not just a stand of trees. It is fuel insects, shelter, birds' shade, vantage, perhaps danger. A rocky outcrop is not merely a shape on the ground. It is a marker, a lookout, a meeting place, a good place to scan for movement at dusk. A marsh is food at one time of year, disease at another, safety in one season, entrapment in another. The land is read and read repeatedly. What survives in the archaeological record suggests a level of environmental intimacy that is difficult for modern people to imagine, because it is not simply knowledge of nature in a general sense. It is knowledge of very specific places in very specific conditions, held collectively and tested constantly. That older order does not make life easy. Infants die, injuries linger, hunger always remains close enough to be felt. A failed hunt is not disappointment, but arithmetic. The body pays quickly for misjudgment, and yet within this difficulty there is still a kind of coherence. The risks are known in outline. They can be prepared for because they tend to recur in recognizable ways. People know which members of the group are best at reading tracks, who notices weather, who remembers alternate water, who can find edible routes when larger plans fail. Skills are distributed, but they fit into a world that still rewards inherited timing. Experience matters because yesterday and tomorrow resemble one another enough for lessons to hold. This is why the hidden change becomes so disruptive later. It does not enter a blank human condition. It enters a stable arrangement between memory and environment. To understand what changes, it helps to linger first in what existed before. Imagine the annual sequence of a mobile group whose life depends on several linked habitats. Open ground in one part of the year for large animals, river margins in another for fish, birds or plant foods, woodland edge when heat rises or game disperses, sheltered elevations when flooding threatens lower ground. None of this needs to be rigid to be reliable. Flexibility already exists. Humans are not prisoners of habit in some crude way. But flexibility works best when it operates inside boundaries that remain broadly trustworthy. There are fallback plans, yes, but the fallback plans also depend on a world whose alternatives continue to be there. Social life grows around this trust in recurrence. Children are taught not just what things are, but when they matter. Instruction is seasonal as much as verbal. It is embodied in walking, waiting, watching, imitating. A child learns the smell of mud when water is receding, the texture of bark on trees that indicate nearby moisture, the behavior of birds that betray larger animals, the places where insects gather after rain, the angle of light that tells how much day remains for a return. Much of this teaching likely happens without formal explanation. It is absorbed through repetition, correction, and example. The evidence remains incomplete because behavior fossilizes poorly, but ethnographic parallels and the sophistication of early human adaptation strongly suggest that deep memory and careful apprenticeship are already central features of life long before cities or writing appear. There is also a moral geography to this older world. Places are not neutral. Some are associated with abundance, others with loss. A slope where someone once fell during a hunt carries warning. A spring that sustained the group in a harsh season carries gratitude whether spoken formally or not. Repeated return gives emotional weight to land. Home in this sense is not always permanence in one fixed settlement. It is familiarity across movement. People belong to circuits, not just points. They belong to pathways, to expected transitions, to clusters of places that make survival possible together. A good route is almost a social inheritance. To know it is to stand inside the accumulated experience of others. This older arrangement likely shapes human psychology in subtle ways. Time is not measured in abstract units, but in sequences of signs. The body learns when to conserve effort and when to spend it. Attention rests heavily on immediate cues, but immediate cues remain meaningful because they connect to longer patterns. A cloud bank, a flowering patch, a shift in animal droppings, a cooling wind at a certain hour, all of these can matter because they belong to a world that still offers enough continuity for such signals to be legible. One surprising detail from studies of traditional ecological knowledge is how often people rely on linked indicators rather than isolated ones. Not one sign, but several converging signs. Not simply rain, but rain combined with soil condition, plant state, insect behavior, and the remembered timing of prior years. That is an intelligent relationship with uncertainty, but it depends on the background assumption that signs continue to correspond with outcomes often enough to justify trust. Food practices reflect the same structure. A hunt is never merely a hunt. It is tied to weather, terrain, animal behavior, the likely condition of the group, and how much can be risked. Gathering too is rarely opportunistic in the careless sense. It depends on knowing where concentration occurs and when return is worthwhile. Processing matters, timing matters, sharing matters. Even before later storage becomes more central, many human groups are already balancing immediate consumption with delayed use in modest but significant ways. Fire itself may belong here as part of an older stabilizing system, not just for warmth and protection, but for transforming difficult foods, extending usability, and making certain environments more workable. Scholars still debate the exact chronology and variability of these practices across regions, but no serious account of early humans treats them as simple creatures stumbling from meal to meal. The world also holds other humans. Neighboring groups may be rivals, trading partners, marriage networks, temporary allies, or all of these in shifting proportion. Here too reliability matters. Paths intersect in expected places. Resources create known points of contact or avoidance. Tension can be managed when the broad geography of movement remains legible. Even danger has pattern. A territory is feared because it is known to produce conflict at certain moments. A region is avoided in lean years because competition intensifies there. The old world is not harmonious, but it is structured enough for strategy to exist, and structure breeds confidence of a particular kind. Not the confidence of mastery over nature, which would be absurd, but the confidence that survival can be learned. Older individuals matter partly because they anchor this confidence. They remember rare bad years, hidden routes, overlooked foods, unusual animal movements. In stable conditions, such memory is immensely valuable because once learned, it remains relevant for a long time. A drought remembered from decades earlier can teach the group how to endure the next one if the pattern remains within known limits. Experience has authority because the world keeps paying it back. There is a tenderness in that even amid hardship. People sleep beside knowledge they trust. They wake into uncertainty, yes, but not into chaos. The child who watches adults divide effort, choose direction, and read the land is inheriting a world that still seems in broad outline answerable. It can wound, starve, freeze, or mislead them, but it does not yet seem to be changing the rules themselves. That distinction matters. Hardship inside a familiar system is not the same as hardship inside a shifting one. The old world also allows room for continuity and identity. If a group follows broadly similar routes over generations, then stories, habits, and practical knowledge reinforce one another. A remembered crossing becomes part of who they are. A seasonal gathering ground is not just useful but socially important. Ceremonial behavior, however simple or elaborate, may gather around repeated return. The first traces of symbolic thought and place-based attachment do not need settled villages to exist. They can emerge wherever repetition deepens meaning. The archaeological record hints at this through recurrent occupation sites, patterned use of landscape, and the transport of materials across distances that suggest remembered preference rather than random movement. All of this belongs to the world before the invisible hinge turns. Not a paradise, not a static age of balance, not some fantasy of perfect adaptation. Human life has always involved improvisation, conflict, and loss, but it is a world in which inherited knowledge still fits the ground closely enough to retain its full force. A route learned from elders still leads where expected. A season still behaves within a known range. A place that once saved the group can still be counted on to help save them again. The mind that grows in such a world values attention, memory, and cooperation already, but it does not yet need to reorganize itself around chronic instability. That is the crucial point. The change that comes later does not invent human intelligence out of nothing. It pressures existing intelligence into a different posture. It does not create social life planning or memory from scratch. It deepens them, stretches them, and gives them new urgency. But to see how profound that later pressure will be, the earlier arrangement has to be understood first. Humans are not transformed because they were once simple. They are transformed because even a sophisticated place-bound rhythm-based way of life can begin to falter when the environment stops keeping its old promises. And at first, of course, the promises do not seem broken. Not entirely. A group still finds water where water has usually been found. An old route still works until one season it works poorly. The animals still pass through, though the herd is smaller and scattered. A fruiting place still gives food, though not enough for everyone. The old world still holds, but only just. That is why nobody can yet call it a new world. The structure remains visible enough to trust even as small failures begin appearing inside it like cracks in stone. The older order survives not because nothing has changed, but because enough of it still works to keep belief alive. Belief in pattern will be the last thing to go, and when it starts to weaken, humans will not simply lose confidence. They will begin to compensate. They will watch harder, remember more, move differently, and slowly build a new kind of life on top of the fading reliability of the old one. But that comes later. For now, the ancient rhythm still breathes. It still guides footsteps across open ground. It still gathers people around expected places. It still makes the world feel in all its danger like something that can be known. The shift begins far from any fire a human tends. It begins in systems too large to feel directly and too slow to witness in full. Ice expands and retreats across enormous distances. Rain belts drift. Ocean currents alter the transfer of heat. Seasonal contrasts sharpen in one region and soften in another. Grasslands spread, then break. Forest edges advance, then pull back. Lakes deepen and disappear. Coasts move inward or outward over generations, redrawing pathways no one would think to call temporary until they are gone. No one living through such changes can stand at the center of them and name the process. They only live in the consequences. Yet this is where the hidden force gathers its power in the quiet fact that a planet does not need to convulse dramatically in order to rearrange the lives of every creature depending on it. For prehistoric humans, climate is never an abstract backdrop. It is the architecture of possibility. Temperature affects where plants can thrive, where animals can graze, how long water remains available, how easy it is to travel, and how dangerous a landscape becomes at different points in the year. A small change in average conditions can produce much larger changes in ecological behavior. A slightly cooler or drier pattern may shift the balance between woodland and open country. A change in rainfall timing may determine not merely whether a place is pleasant, but whether it is habitable at all for part of the year. One of the most important and least intuitive truths in paleoclimate research is that ecosystems often do not respond gradually in the same smooth way as the climate variable that affects them. They can cross thresholds. A modest change in moisture can suddenly transform vegetation cover. A slight change in seasonality can reorder migration patterns. The signal is slow at planetary scale but sharp in lived experience. That matters because humans are not adapting to temperature in isolation. They're adapting to the instability temperature and rainfall produce in everything else. A valley that once held mixed resources may become thinner, more seasonal, less forgiving. A corridor linking one region to another may become easier to cross for centuries, then difficult again. Shorelines created by lower sea levels may expose wide, rich landscapes for generations and then drown them. The world of deep prehistory includes many such lost lands and vanished routes. Scholars still debate the precise timing and local significance of some of them, but the broad pattern is clear enough. The physical ground beneath human habits is changing repeatedly, and these changes are not evenly distributed. Some places become refuges, some become traps, some become bridges for movement and exchange, others harden into barriers. The grand mechanisms behind these shifts have often been described through cycles in Earth's orbit, and tilt the slow variations that affect how sunlight is distributed across the planet over long spans of time. These processes do not flip human history like a switch. Their influence is filtered through atmosphere, ocean, ice geography, and chance. But over thousands of years they help produce worlds that feel markedly different to the creatures inhabiting them. A greener Sahara, for example, is not a poetic exaggeration from the distant past, but a real condition during wetter intervals when lakes and grasslands spread across regions later known as severe desert. In colder and drier periods, those pathways contract or disappear. People and animals do not simply stay in place while climate oscillates around them. They move, fragment, mix, adapt, or fail. There is a temptation to imagine that early humans experienced these changes as a series of simple migrations, as though groups merely packed up and headed elsewhere whenever conditions worsened. The reality is more demanding. Movement itself depends on knowledge, timing, physical endurance, and luck. New terrain can be richer, but it can also be occupied unfamiliar or deceptive. A path that looks promising may conceal seasonal dead ends. A water source may be reliable only in specific months. Coastal abundance may alternate with deadly exposure during storms or shifting tides. What survives in the record suggests that human movement during environmental transition is often not a clean march from one world to another, but a hesitant, repeated testing of possibilities. This is why the hidden change acts not only on bodies but on expectations. The old assumption that landscapes can be learned once and trusted for long stretches begins to weaken. Not everywhere at once and not in every generation, but often enough to matter. Imagine a place where winters become more variable. One year they pass lightly. Another year they press harder and longer. The signs that once predicted seasonal transition begin arriving at unfamiliar intervals. Or imagine a dryland region where rare rains once came within a remembered range enough to sustain a chain of usable stops across open country. Then that range widens. The rains still come, but less reliably. Suddenly the landscape is no longer a sequence of dependable points. It becomes a gamble between scarcity and opportunity. Environmental variability may be more important here than average change alone. Humans can adapt to many harsh climates if those climates remain legible. What becomes truly disruptive is unpredictability. A consistently dry landscape can still support sophisticated survival if its patterns remain stable enough to teach. But a landscape that swings, surprises, or slowly shifts, its timing undermines confidence in inherited behavior. Paleoclimate records from lake sediments, ice cores, marine deposits, and pollen sequences increasingly suggest that many regions inhabited by humans were not simply moving from one stable condition to another, but passing through intervals of fluctuation intense enough to matter behaviorally. No single explanation fully accounts for the diversity of human response, yet the cumulative picture is difficult to ignore. The environment is not just changing, it is becoming hard to read. That difficulty has a deep psychological consequence. It moves survival away from habit and toward monitoring. In a more predictable world, knowledge can be carried as tradition with occasional adjustment. In a changing world, knowledge must be updated more aggressively. People must notice weak signals earlier. The first signs of delay in animal movement. The first hint that a watercourse is failing. The first evidence that one plant community is replacing another. This sort of attention has always mattered. What changes now is the penalty for getting it wrong and the frequency with which old assumptions need correction. There is also a compression of safe margins. In a forgiving environment, errors are costly but often survivable. A group can arrive somewhat late and still find enough. A secondary location can cover the mistake. But when resources are more scattered or seasonal windows, narrow timing becomes cruel. Being slightly wrong may mean walking farther with less strength. It may mean meeting rival groups under worse conditions. It may mean losing children, elders, or the injured, because the buffer between plan and failure has narrowed. This is one reason scholars sometimes argue that environmental stress contributed not merely to migration or technological change, but to deeper transformations in cooperation and cognition. The evidence remains incomplete, and direct causation is difficult to prove, but the logic is powerful. A world with tighter margins rewards foresight with increasing intensity. At the same time, opportunity is woven into disruption. New corridors open when others close. Lower sea levels in some periods expose coastal shelves and land bridges that later vanish. Retreating ice creates fresh ecological zones. Changing vegetation may attract prey into areas previously less useful. River systems shift and create rich margins where people can return repeatedly. Human history is not simply a story of climate as enemy. It is a story of climate as relentless editor, removing one possibility while introducing another. That is partly why the record of adaptation appears so varied. Some populations flourish in altered conditions by taking advantage of new edges, new concentrations, new mixes of resource types. Others disappear from certain areas altogether. Survival is never guaranteed by change alone. It depends on whether behavior can keep pace with the moving pattern. One striking detail from paleoenvironmental research is how much of human prehistory unfolds near ecological boundaries, places where woodland meets grassland, river meets dry plain, coast meets inland corridor. These edges are often productive because they offer diversity, but they are also sensitive. Small climatic shifts can push the boundary itself, changing the balance of foods, materials, and animal presence in ways that ripple outward into human life. A group living at such an edge may not experience the planet changing in any grand cinematic way. They experience a familiar place becoming slightly less itself year after year. And because human memory is social, these shifts create tension not just between people and land, but between generations. Elders remember when a route worked better, when a crossing was easier, when a seasonal camp held more abundance. The young grow up under altered conditions and may interpret the old knowledge differently. Perhaps the elders seem wiser than ever, because rare memories become precious in unstable times. Or perhaps their confidence begins to seem less absolute because the world they learned so thoroughly no longer behaves quite as it did. Both possibilities may have existed in different places and periods. What matters is that environmental change is no longer merely physical. It has entered the transmission of authority itself. This is the point where a planet tilts into difference, not because the sky looks unfamiliar every morning, but because continuity becomes harder to rely on. The landscape still teaches, but it no longer teaches the same lesson for as long. The old human compact with place starts to strain. A successful route is successful for fewer years in a row. A fallback resource becomes less dependable. A known season widens or contracts just enough to disrupt planning. None of this produces immediate revolution. It produces repeated low-level correction, then more correction, then a habit of correction. That habit may be one of the most important inheritances in the whole story. Humans do not merely endure a changing planet. They begin slowly to become creatures organized around anticipated change itself. This is not yet civilization, not yet agriculture, not yet the formal systems later societies build to manage uncertainty. It is something older and quieter, the growing need to prepare for worlds that shift beneath memory. The one thing no one notices in full is not only climate in the technical sense, it is the erosion of reliable repetition. Once that erosion begins, the mind must lean forward. It must scan beyond the present moment. It must hold more possibilities open. It must become suspicious of comfort. By the time any one group fully realizes an old pattern is gone, the change has already been at work for generations. The marsh has shrunk enough to alter bird and fish cycles. The open ground has spread enough to redirect prey. The rains have changed enough to break a chain of trusted stops. The coast has moved enough to erase a remembered abundance, and still from day to day life continues in recognizable acts. People wake, search, cook, repair, teach, and move. That is why the transformation is so easy to miss. It hides inside continuity even while it is dismantling it. Soon those dismantled certainties will begin appearing in practical disruptions close enough to feel in the body. Water will be farther than memory likes. Food will demand more patience than hunger wants to give. Timing will become sharper, less forgiving, more central to survival. And once that begins, the invisible planetary shift will no longer be something happening to the background. It will start entering camp, entering decision, entering thought. The first real signs do not arrive as revelation. They arrive as irritation. A walk that should be shorter takes longer. A water source that should still be holding is already low. The animals that usually pass within reach do not vanish entirely, but they arrive scattered, nervous, harder to predict. A grove that once justified the effort of return gives less than expected. Nothing about this feels historic. It feels inconvenient, then tiring, then faintly troubling. People do what people always do when the world becomes slightly less cooperative. They adapt one decision at a time. That is how large changes enter daily life. Not with a declaration, but with a string of practical corrections so small they're easy to mistake for ordinary flexibility. The group leaves a camp earlier than planned because the nearby resources are thinning too fast. They send someone farther uphill to check for moisture in places usually visited later in the season. They divide effort more carefully. because a failed search now costs more energy. They carry more when they move or else move in stages because certain stretches have become less trustworthy. A route that once served as the safe option becomes the risky one. Another route, longer but shaded, begins to matter more. The body learns these adjustments before any formal explanation does. One of the clearest ways hidden environmental change becomes human change is through distance. If water prey or seasonal plant foods are pushed even slightly farther apart, then every choice about movement begins to sharpen. Walking farther means spending more energy before food is secured. It means children tire sooner. It means elders and the injured become more vulnerable. It means carrying weight has a different cost. It means returning before dark becomes less certain. It means the margin between success and failure narrows, not because life has become impossible, but because its arithmetic has become meaner. Scholars still debate the exact relationship between environmental stress and the pace of behavioral change in different regions, but no serious account ignores how profoundly small increases in distance can reshape survival. Water is often the first teacher in this harsher arithmetic. It structures movement more severely than many other resources because it cannot be postponed for long. A spring that weakens a wetland that shrinks a seasonal stream that no longer flows at the expected time, these changes do not merely inconvenience people. They reorganize the map in the mind. Paths that once linked hunting grounds, shelters, and gathering places may no longer connect cleanly if the water between them becomes unreliable. A stop that was once routine becomes a gamble. A gamble repeated often enough becomes strategy, and strategy repeated long enough becomes culture. The difficulty is that the early disruptions are rarely uniform. One year a failing source may recover after late rains. Another year it may collapse altogether. This inconsistency may be more destabilizing than permanent scarcity, because it tempts people to trust what is already weakening. The old pattern still works often enough to remain plausible. That lingering plausibility is dangerous. It encourages one more return, one more attempt, one more season of believing that what looks temporary really is temporary. The evidence remains incomplete, but this is one likely reason. Gradual change presses so deeply on human behavior, it punishes certainty slowly. Food follows the same pattern. In a stable world, even a hard one, people can build expectations around known combinations of resources. If one food fails, another may cover it. If large game becomes scarce, gathered foods or smaller prey may sustain the group for a while. But under shifting conditions, fallback foods can also become unreliable or require more labor at exactly the moment labor is already strained. An edible root may still exist in a familiar place, but deeper in the soil because the ground is drier. Fish may still be present, but only in reduced pools that attract competitors. Herd animals may still migrate, but not along the same edge, not in the same numbers, not with the same timing. Every resource begins asking for more precision. Precision changes attention. People must notice earlier signs, compare more variables, and hold more possible outcomes in mind. It is no longer enough to know that animals pass through a valley. It matters whether they are likely to pass in the first part of the season, or the second, whether recent weather has altered their speed, whether the water beyond the valley will hold long enough if the hunt stretches into another day. One lesser-known detail from hunter-gatherer studies is that skilled environmental decision-making often depends on nested plans rather than single intentions. There is the preferred target, the second option, the contingency, if weather shifts the fallback, if another group has already arrived, the last resort if all else fails. In more volatile conditions, this branching structure of thought becomes more valuable. Perhaps it becomes unavoidable. These first quiet disruptions also change social texture. When resources tighten unevenly, disagreements over timing and direction can become more serious. Should the group stay longer because the signs of recovery are still possible, or leave now before effort is wasted? Should they trust remembered abundance in a distant place, or conserve strength near what little is already known? No one experiences these decisions as abstract exercises in adaptation. They are immediate, bodily, and costly. A wrong decision means hunger, injury, delay, exposure, resentment. The group does not need formal politics for these tensions to matter. Cooperation becomes harder precisely when it becomes more necessary. Children experience the change differently, but perhaps more deeply. They are learning the world at the exact moment the world is becoming less learnable in the old way. An adult may feel the discrepancy between memory and present reality. A child feels only instruction adjusted on the move. Do not count on that stream so late. Do not expect the birds there anymore. Watch the wind before climbing that ridge. Carry more. Leave sooner. Return faster. Their education becomes saturated with correction. Over generations, those corrections accumulate into a new baseline of what caution looks like. The same is true of time. In a world with looser margins, lateness becomes more expensive. A group that reaches a feeding ground after the brief window of abundance has already passed may find almost nothing. A camp moved too late may trap people in bad conditions with too little water or fuel. The ancient human relationship to time, already complex and ecological, begins to harden around narrower windows. Patience remains important, but so does anticipation. Waiting is no longer passive. It becomes a monitored risk. People are not merely enduring the season, they are calculating it with great attention. This tightening of time may be one of the least visible but most significant behavioral consequences of gradual environmental change. The first revolution is not always technological. Sometimes it is temporal. The group begins to live more consciously inside sequences, thresholds, and deadlines imposed by a less forgiving landscape. They may not count days abstractly, but they count signs with increasing seriousness. The flowering is later. The water is lower already. The animals have not appeared. The heat is rising too quickly. There is less room now for drifting along inherited rhythm. The rhythm must be watched. There are also places that begin to fail symbolically before they fail completely in practice. A trusted camp where returns once felt reassuring now carries unease. People still go there, but with less confidence. A route passed down across generations no longer feels like inherited security. It feels like a question. This matters because land is never only material, it holds memory. To lose trust in a place is to lose trust in accumulated experience. That can be destabilizing in ways archaeology barely captures. A broken pattern is not just a broken supply line. It is a small fracture in the continuity between past and present. Yet the answer is not despair. It is modification. People start using familiar places differently. They stay for shorter periods. They arrive with more caution. They explore side corridors that once seemed unnecessary. They diversify effort across wider territory. They rely more heavily on those who can read subtle signs or recall rarer alternatives. Perhaps they revisit old techniques. Perhaps they invent minor improvements. Perhaps they share more tightly within the group while becoming less tolerant of outsiders or the opposite, in some regions where exchange becomes the safer path. No single explanation fully accounts for the diversity of these responses, because landscapes differ, neighbouring populations differ, and the pace of change differs. But the broad movement is unmistakable. Flexibility stops being a strength used occasionally and becomes a condition of survival. This is the stage where many old certainties are not yet gone but no longer deserve their former confidence. That in-between state is exhausting. It requires constant low-level vigilance. Too much suspicion wastes energy. Too much trust invites disaster. People must balance memory against fresh observation every time they move. And because observation can contradict inherited expectation, a subtle transformation begins in the way knowledge itself is valued. It is not enough to remember. One must also verify. One must test the world again and again. From outside, looking back across thousands of years, this phase can appear almost invisible. There are no grand ruins left by a slightly longer walk to water. No inscriptions record the growing uncertainty of a once trusted valley. But traces remain. Changes in how often sites are occupied. Shifts in animal remains. Different patterns of movement inferred from stone materials carried across longer distances. More repeated use of locations that offer strategic advantage rather than simple abundance. These are quiet clues, but together they suggest people living under rising pressure to adapt without ever seeing the full shape of what pressured them. And that may be the most human part of the story. People do not pause history to analyze the conditions transforming them. They remain inside the work of living. They wait cold or thirsty or hopeful. They gather what they can. They decide. They revise. They endure. The hidden change enters not through theory, but through fatigue, caution, and repeated adjustment. The old route is still visible underfoot, but it no longer leads cleanly into the future. So new behavior begins not as ideology, not as invention for its own sake, but as the practical residue of surviving one difficult choice after another. Soon those choices will do more than alter movement. They will start reshaping habits of mind planning, memory cooperation, risk patience, and the social value of those who can hold complexity without breaking under it. But before behavior bends in that fuller sense, it first learns to flinch. It learns that the world can remain recognizable while becoming less reliable. It learns that what was once merely inconvenient may now be decisive. It learns slowly that the background has stopped staying in the background. Once disruption becomes familiar, even if it is never named as such, behavior begins to reorganize around it. Not in a single decisive moment, but in a steady accumulation of small practical shifts that slowly change what it means to be prepared. At first, people simply try harder to do what has always worked. They revisit known places more frequently, double-check signs, rely more heavily on those with experience. But as uncertainty persists, effort alone stops being enough. The problem is no longer just finding food or water. The problem is deciding how to think about finding them. In a world that no longer behaves consistently, reaction becomes dangerous. Acting only when need becomes urgent means arriving too late. The group that waits until thirst is pressing may find the nearest water source already diminished or occupied. The group that hunts only when hunger is immediate may find prey dispersed or already moved on. A subtle but critical shift begins here. Survival starts to favor anticipation rather than response. Not everywhere, not instantly, but often enough to matter. The difference is small at first. A decision to move earlier than necessary. A habit of checking conditions before committing effort. A willingness to leave a place that still offers something in order to reach one that might offer more. This kind of thinking demands a different relationship with time. The present is no longer sufficient as a guide. The near future begins to carry more weight. People must imagine what conditions will be, not just what they are. That imagination is grounded in experience, but it extends beyond it. It becomes an active tool rather than a passive memory. One lesser-known insight from studies of early human cognition is that planning depth, the ability to project multiple steps ahead, appears to expand gradually rather than suddenly. There is no single invention of foresight. Instead, environmental pressure may have made longer chains of anticipation increasingly useful. Memory changes alongside planning. In a stable world, memory is about repetition. Remember what worked and do it again. In a shifting world, memory must include variation. It must hold exceptions, rare events, unusual outcomes. A place that failed once may succeed again under different conditions. A rare water source used only in extreme years becomes more relevant if extreme years become more common. Knowledge becomes layered. Not just what usually happens, but what sometimes happens. Not just the main route, but the marginal one. Not just the obvious signal, but the faint warning that something is off. This layering of memory has social consequences. Individuals who can retain and interpret more complex patterns gain importance, not necessarily as leaders in any formal sense, but as anchors of decision-making. The person who remembers a distant valley that still holds water in an unusually dry season. The one who notices that certain animals behave differently before a shift in weather. The one who recalls that a route avoided in most years becomes viable under specific conditions. These forms of knowledge are not abstract achievements. They are survival tools. What survives in the record suggests that human groups may have increasingly relied on distributed expertise where different individuals contribute different fragments of understanding. At the same time, cooperation becomes more tightly bound to success. In a predictable environment, sharing is valuable, but the system can tolerate occasional imbalance. In a less predictable one, cooperation may become the difference between survival and fragmentation. Food that arrives irregularly is harder to divide, yet more important to share. Movement decisions require consensus or at least coordination, because splitting at the wrong moment can expose both groups to greater risk. Caring for children, the injured and the elderly becomes more complex when conditions tighten. Scholars still debate how directly environmental variability drives social complexity, but there is strong reason to believe that uncertainty increases the cost of isolation. Risk itself begins to feel different. In earlier conditions, risk is often tied to visible danger, a dangerous animal, a contested territory, a storm. Under shifting conditions, risk becomes more abstract. It lies in timing, in probability, in incomplete information. Should the group pursue a distant opportunity that might yield high reward or stay near a diminishing but known resource? Should they cross a stretch of uncertain terrain to reach a place remembered from long ago, or conserve energy in a less promising but safer area? These are not decisions that can be resolved through instinct alone. They require weighing possibilities, balancing immediate need against future potential. The body also adapts to this new pattern of decision-making. Energy is no longer spent only in bursts of effort, but managed more carefully over longer stretches. Carrying becomes more strategic. Rest becomes more deliberate. Movement is not just about reaching a place, but about preserving strength for what comes after. This is not a dramatic transformation that would be obvious in skeletal remains, but subtle changes in wear patterns, movement routes and site usage hint at shifts in how people organize effort across time. One of the most profound changes may occur in attention itself. In a stable environment, attention can rest on what is immediately relevant because the broader pattern holds. In a changing one, attention must widen. People must notice more, track more, compare more signals. The wind, the soil, the behavior of animals, the condition of plants, the position of water, the timing of light. Each of these carries information that may now matter more urgently. Attention becomes both sharper and more distributed. It must catch early signs of change without being overwhelmed by noise. There is also a growing need to tolerate uncertainty without freezing. Too much hesitation wastes opportunity. Too much confidence invites error. The balance between action and caution becomes delicate. Groups that adapt well may develop ways of sharing uncertainty, spreading decision-making across multiple perspectives, rather than relying on a single judgment. This is not democracy in any modern sense, but it is a form of collective reasoning shaped by necessity. No single explanation fully accounts for how these processes unfold across all regions, but the trend toward more flexible, responsive behavior appears again and again in the archaeological and anthropological record. As behavior bends under pressure, it begins to produce feedback. Successful strategies are repeated. Failed ones are abandoned more quickly. Teaching becomes more explicit in some cases as the cost of misunderstanding rises. Children may be guided more carefully through complex tasks, not because adults suddenly decide to teach differently, but because the environment demands more precise knowledge earlier. The gap between knowing and not knowing widens in consequence. Fire tools and simple technologies may also take on new roles within this changing system, not necessarily as sudden breakthroughs, but as stabilizing elements. Fire allows food to be processed more efficiently, extends the usability of certain resources, and creates predictable points of safety. Tools can make extraction from difficult environments more reliable. Storage, even in modest forms, can buffer against short-term scarcity. Scholars still debate the timing and extent of these developments, but it is difficult to separate them from the broader context of environmental pressure. They are not isolated innovations. They are responses embedded in a shifting world. Perhaps the most important change is invisible, the gradual alignment of human behavior with uncertainty itself. Instead of resisting variability, people begin to expect it. Instead of assuming continuity, they prepare for disruption. This does not eliminate risk, but it changes its meaning. Risk becomes something to be managed rather than avoided entirely. The group learns to live inside a moving system rather than relying on a fixed one, and still no one sees the full pattern. No one stands at the edge of this transformation and declares that human behavior is being reshaped. Each adjustment feels local, temporary, practical. The group survives one difficult season then another. They refine their habits, deepen their memory, strengthen their cooperation, sharpen their attention. Over time, these adjustments accumulate into something larger than any individual decision. The old world does not disappear overnight. It lingers in habits, in expectations, in the stories people tell about how things used to be. But alongside it, a new way of living is taking shape, one that is less dependent on stable patterns and more attuned to change itself. This new behavior is not yet culture in the full sense that later societies will recognize, but it is the foundation from which culture will grow. The one thing humans never fully noticed is no longer just a background shift in climate or landscape. It has entered the structure of thought. It has begun to define what it means to be prepared to be attentive, to be human. And once behavior bends in this way, it does not easily bend back. As the old certainties loosen, the landscape itself begins sorting people. Not through any formal boundary, not through a line drawn on earth, but through a quiet test of flexibility. Some terrains now reward mobility above all else, others reward repeated return. Some become dangerous because they no longer produce enough in a reliable rhythm. Others become unexpectedly valuable because they sit at the meeting point of several resources at once. Grassland opening beside woodland edge. River corridors cutting through dry country. Sheltered uplands above seasonal flood. Coasts rich with shellfish birds, stranded animals and fish runs when the timing is right. Human beings do not enter these environments as blank creatures. They arrive carrying older habits, remembered roots, social expectations and practical knowledge shaped elsewhere. But new landscapes begin pressing on them hard enough to change what parts of that inheritance still work. A grassland, for instance, offers distance. It opens sight lines, makes movement visible, stretches the horizon, and often brings large grazing animals within the frame of human planning. But it also exposes the body. Shade becomes scarce. Water may be concentrated and therefore contested. Wind can strip warmth with astonishing speed in colder seasons. A woodland edge offers contrast instead, cover fuel. Small prey, edible plants nesting, birds, insects, roots, and shelter from exposure, but often with more fragmented visibility and different movement constraints. A river corridor can function as a lifeline, carrying water, fish reeds, birds, and the repeated attraction of herbivores while also concentrating danger, disease, and competition. A drying plain may look empty from afar and yet contain brief, intense windows of opportunity after rain. Every terrain teaches a different balance between patience and speed, between broad scanning and close reading, between carrying on and turning back. What changes now is not only where people go, but what survival begins to select for in behavior. In more variable environments, specialization can become risky if it locks a group too tightly to one kind of place or one narrow pattern of return. Flexibility grows more valuable. A group able to exploit multiple settings, shift diet change, movement style, and revise expectations quickly may survive where a more rigidly patterned group falters. This does not mean people become rootless in some simple way. What survives in the record suggests repeated attachments to strategic places remain very important. But attachment now has to coexist with adaptability. A place may still matter deeply, yet no longer be enough on its own. This is visible, however faintly, in the archaeological traces people leave behind. Stone materials are sometimes carried across greater distances than one would expect, from a tightly local life suggesting wider movement or wider exchange networks. Sites appear in clusters that imply repeated use of linked ecological zones, rather than dependence on a single type of habitat. Animal remains indicate shifting diets or opportunistic use of whatever a region offers at a particular moment. Scholars still debate the scale of these changes in different periods and different populations, but the broader pattern remains compelling. People are not simply occupying landscapes. They are learning to move between them with increasing sophistication. That sophistication changes social structure. A group navigating several environments cannot rely on one mode of expertise alone. The best tracker on open ground may not be the best reader of river conditions. The person who knows where tubers can still be dug in. Bad seasons may not be the same person who understands the movement of herds after unusual weather. In a world with more ecological variety and less stability, knowledge becomes both broader and more distributed. Survival may depend on combining several partial understandings rather than trusting one dominant skill. This does not create equality in any simple sense. Some forms of knowledge likely become more prestigious, especially under pressure, but it does suggest a growing premium on social systems capable of holding diverse expertise together. Movement strategies begin to shift as well. In older, more stable conditions, routes may have been strongly habitual in a reassuring way. Now routes become conditional. A path is good if the rain has come. A river crossing is safe if the upstream ground has not already dried too early. A coastal margin is worth the effort if shellfish beds remain exposed long enough and storms have not altered access. A wooded rise is worth revisiting if signs of animal passage are still fresh. Human beings begin to inhabit possibility spaces rather than fixed itineraries. They still move through real terrain, but the logic of that movement grows more contingent, more comparative, more alert to alternatives. One lesser known but important detail from ecological anthropology is that mixed environments often reward edge intelligence, the ability to exploit transitions rather than cause. The richest returns are not always deep in one ecosystem or another, but along boundaries where several systems overlap. That insight matters here, because changing climates frequently erase or reposition such boundaries. A group capable of noticing and using those shifts may find resilience where others find confusion. River mouths, estuaries, lake margins, forest grassland transitions, upland lower slope combinations, these can become strategic anchors in uncertain worlds. They do not eliminate risk, but they offer choice, and choice becomes a survival resource. Coastal environments deserve special attention. For many prehistoric groups, coasts are not peripheral. They are rich, dynamic, and often surprisingly reliable, compared with interior zones under stress, though only when people understand their timing and hazards. Tide-stranded marine life fish runs, shellfish beds, seabirds, and drift materials can create dense opportunities in a narrow strip of land. But coasts are also unstable over long spans. Sea levels rise and fall, shorelines migrate, productive flats drown or emerge, storms alter access points. The same coast that nourishes one generation may look very different to another. What survives in the record suggests some human populations became extraordinarily adept at exploiting coastal mosaics, while others remained more anchored inland. No single explanation fully accounts for this diversity, but it is hard to miss how strongly changing shorelines could reward flexible thinking. Drying landscapes create a different pressure. In plains or semi-arid zones, resources may become more scattered with high value, concentrated around rare water or brief seasonal abundance. This tends to reward wide knowledge, careful timing, and social strategies for managing movement through risk. It may also intensify contact, peaceful or hostile, where corridors narrow. If everyone is being funneled toward fewer dependable points, then other humans become more central to the survival equation. Cooperation, exchange, avoidance, competition, and intermarriage all become more consequential when geography compresses opportunity. Woodland and forest margins, by contrast, may reward finer-grained observation and more varied diets, especially where large game is less predictable. Here, survival may depend not only on chasing abundance, but on assembling it from many smaller sources: nuts, fruits, roots, small mammals, birds, fish, insects, and seasonally available plants. This kind of environment can support remarkable resilience, but often only for groups with deep local knowledge and patience for dispersed effort. Under changing conditions, such knowledge becomes even more valuable, though perhaps harder to transmit if the environment itself keeps shifting. These varied landscapes do more than alter subsistence. They shape emotional life and group identity. People who live by broad movement across exposed country experience space differently from those who return repeatedly to dense river corridors or sheltered woodland edges. Their sense of risk, distance, and opportunity differs. Their children learn different cues. Their stories likely emphasize different landmarks, dangers, and forms of success. Human difference, even before the age of cities, is already ecological in part. New landscapes are making new humans, not in the sense of producing separate species overnight, but in the sense of bending attention, memory, and social habit along different lines. And yet beneath that diversity, a common pattern is emerging. Environments that once allowed relatively straightforward repetition now demand layered flexibility. The group that survives is increasingly the group that can revise without collapsing, move without losing coherence, remember without becoming trapped by memory, and attached to place without depending on one place alone. This is a subtle transformation, but a profound one. It turns adaptability from a useful trait into a central organizing principle, That principle likely affects even tool use in quiet ways, not just in making better tools, but in choosing portable ones, repairable ones, multi-use ones, or raw materials that justify transport because they extend options in uncertain territory. A stone edge that can process wood animal tissue and plant matter across several habitats has value beyond its immediate function. So does the knowledge of where good stone can be found when crossing between ecological zones. Material culture, however simple it appears at a glance, is part of this wider system of flexibility. By now, the unnoticed change has begun to operate at several levels at once. The climate shifts, the vegetation shifts, animal movement shifts, human roots shift, social dependence shifts, knowledge shifts. None of these layers alone explains everything, but together they create a powerful ratchet. Once life is organized across a wider range of landscapes under less stable conditions, returning to a narrower, more trusting old rhythm becomes difficult. Even when conditions improve locally, the habit of flexibility may remain. It has become too useful, too deeply woven into survival. So new landscapes do not merely host human beings, they train them. They reward those who can think across distance, across seasons, across habitat boundaries, across incomplete information. The quiet revolution is still unfolding without proclamation. No monument marks it. No one writes its name. But each altered valley, drowned shoreline, opening grassland, shrinking wetland, and uncertain river is teaching the same lesson, in a different dialect survive by changing with the ground, or be left behind by it. What becomes precious in an unstable world is not only strength, speed, or luck, it is memory. Not memory in the sentimental sense, not memory as nostalgia, but memory as infrastructure. When the environment stops repeating itself cleanly, survival depends less on what the body can do in the moment, and more on what the mind can carry across moments. A person who remembers where water survived in a bad year is carrying more than a fact. They're carrying the possibility of continued life. A person who knows that a certain valley looks empty until late in the season, or that a dry slope still hides edible roots, if dug in the right place after sparse rain, holds something as valuable as any tool. The hidden change in the world places new weight on remembered exceptions. In a more predictable setting, memory can afford to be narrow and strong. Remember the usual route. Remember the usual season. Remember the usual signs. But once variation increases, memory must widen. It must become not only a record of what generally works, but a storehouse of anomalies, near failures, rare recoveries, and barely sufficient alternatives. The group needs to know not just the best place, but the second best and third best. Not just the expected timing, but how things looked the year timing went wrong. Not just where food is abundant in ordinary conditions, but what can still be found when ordinary conditions fail. This is one of the great quiet expansions in human behavior. Memory stops serving routine alone and begins serving uncertainty. That shift has consequences for who matters inside a group. Older people may become more valuable in new ways if they can recall rare conditions from long ago. A drought that happened once in childhood may become suddenly relevant decades later if the land starts behaving like that again. A route used only in exceptional circumstances may no longer be a curiosity from the past, but a usable contingency. This does not mean elders are always obeyed or always correct. Scholars still debate how authority was distributed in early human groups and how much weight age alone carried. But what survives in ethnographic comparison suggests that long memory becomes especially important where ecological variability is high. The person who has seen more versions of the world may see possibilities others miss, yet memory under pressure is not only backward-looking, it becomes selective, structured, and teachable. There is too much information in any landscape for all of it to matter equally. So human groups begin perhaps more intensely than before to preserve certain knowledge with special care. Paths, water, seasonal cues, dangerous absences, places that seem empty but are not, places that seem reliable but should no longer be trusted. The transmission of such knowledge need not be formal in the literate sense. It can be carried through repeated journeys, corrected gestures, stories tied to place, ritualized return, or the insistence that children learn not merely to follow, but to notice. This is where memory begins to overlap with cognition in a deeper way. To remember a changing environment is not simply to store information, it is to organize it, to compare years, to distinguish the usual from the unusual, to connect a delayed flowering with a later animal movement, a drying pool with a change in bird behavior and early heat, with the failure of a certain plant. These are patterns across time, not just isolated observations. One lesser known but important point in discussions of human cognitive evolution is that long-term environmental tracking may have favored not merely bigger memory in a crude sense, but more relational memory, the ability to hold linked conditions in mind and use them predictively. The group now needs minds that can do several things at once. They must recall specific places. They must remember how those places differ across seasons. They must notice signs in the present. They must compare those signs with remembered conditions. They must infer what this means for the next move. That is a complicated behavioral demand even before language is considered, and language almost certainly matters here, whether in simple instruction, narrative recall naming of places, or shared warning. No single explanation fully accounts for how humans became so uniquely capable of transmitting detailed ecological knowledge, but increasing environmental variability gives one powerful reason why such transmission would become more valuable with time. It also changes the cost of forgetting. In a world with generous margins, forgotten knowledge is unfortunate but not always fatal. There may be enough redundancy for the group to recover. In a tighter world, forgetting can kill. Forgetting where a fallback water source lies. Forgetting how long a dangerous crossing really takes in a hot season. Forgetting that a promising wet patch dries faster than it appears. Forgetting that a familiar route becomes blocked after rare storms. These are not decorative details, they are survival edges. The evidence remains incomplete because memory itself leaves no direct fossil, but archaeology reveals indirect signs of its growing importance. Repeated occupation of strategic places, long-distance transport of materials that implies stable route knowledge, seasonal return patterns that suggest careful timing, tool forms that indicate repeated learned solutions rather than random improvisation. Children growing up under these conditions inherit more than habits. They inherit warning systems. Their education likely becomes denser with conditional knowledge. Not simply go there, but go there when the wind has shifted this way. Not simply dig here, but dig deeper if the soil is already warm before the usual time. Not simply trust this place, but trust it only after confirming that another sign is also present. In other words, the world is no longer taught as a fixed map. It is taught as a changing map that must be interpreted. That is a profound difference. It asks the young not only to obey memory, but to work with it. This may be one of the turning points in the human relationship to teaching itself. In a fluctuating environment, imitation is still essential, but imitation alone may not be enough. The learner must grasp conditions. The learner must understand when a rule applies and when it does not. This introduces a greater premium on explanation, demonstration, correction, and perhaps on shared attention itself. A child shown a water source is one thing. A child shown why this water source matters only after certain signs is learning at a deeper level. Scholars still debate how early such explicitly conditional teaching emerged and how it varied among different human populations, but the pressure for it seems difficult to dismiss. There is another effect, quieter but far-reaching. Memory extends social trust. If no one individual can hold all the relevant knowledge, then survival depends on trusting others to remember what you do not. One person knows the upland route. Another knows the shellfish beds after storms. Another knows which trees indicate deep moisture. Another remembers the dangerous season for a certain crossing. A group built this way becomes not just a collection of bodies, but a network of remembered worlds. This distributed memory may be one of the great hidden achievements of early human social life. It means the group can know more than any one member, but only if cooperation holds. And because memory is tied to place-changing environments, also alter emotion. A place once associated with rescue may now fail. A place remembered as dangerous may become newly useful. Old confidence and old fear both need revision. That is psychologically demanding. It asks people to preserve attachment while updating expectation. It may also deepen the significance of certain landmarks that remain stable amid surrounding uncertainty. A hill, a rock formation, a cave, a bend in a river, a stand of long-lived trees. These can anchor memory when the living pattern around them becomes less reliable. Physical stability in a shifting world acquires special meaning. Perhaps this is why returning matters so much in so many human histories. Return is not only about resource use, it is about checking memory against reality, going back to see if the old knowledge still holds, revisiting as a form of calibration. A place remembered from scarcity is visited again to test whether scarcity has passed. A route once abandoned is tried again under changed conditions. Human movement becomes in part an ongoing conversation between stored knowledge and present evidence. That conversation grows more complex as the world grows less predictable. Over many generations, this pressure to remember may help shape minds that are unusually suited to cumulative knowledge. Once groups begin depending on layered, conditional, socially shared memory, they are already moving towards something larger than immediate adaptation. They are building the precondition for tradition in a deeper sense. Tradition is no longer merely repetition of ancestral habit. It becomes the careful preservation of useful complexity. A people able to remember rare but crucial knowledge can endure conditions that would erase a group living only from present abundance. That does not mean memory solves everything. It can mislead as well as save. Remembered patterns may harden into assumptions long after the environment that produced them has changed. Elders may cling to roots that no longer work. Stories of former abundance may keep drawing groups back to places that have already failed beyond recovery. The same memory that preserves life can preserve error. That is one reason no single explanation fully accounts for human success in these changing worlds. Memory alone is not enough. It must be paired with observation flexibility and the willingness to revise. Still, the direction of change is clear. The less reliable the world becomes, the more humans must live inside time rather than merely inside place. They must compare the now with the then. They must carry forward the traces of past exceptions. They must teach children not just what the land is, but what it has been, and what it may become under different conditions. In this sense, memory becomes a tool for occupying uncertainty. It allows the past to remain useful even when the present is unstable, and that may be one of the most decisive unseen transformations in all of human history. A species already intelligent, already social, already observant, is being pressed into deeper dependence on stored, shared, conditional knowledge. The world no longer rewards simple recurrence as generously as it once did. It rewards those who can remember across variation. Those who can keep alive the rare route, the delayed season, the hidden source, the near-forgotten sign. Those who can turn memory into preparation. Soon that preparation will extend further still beyond memory of place and season into the management of food, fire, waiting, and delayed reward. Humans will begin structuring more of life around what can be held, preserved, returned to, and anticipated. But before that system hardens into habit, it is memory that carries the burden. Memory that stretches to meet a changing world. Memory that becomes heavier because the world has stopped being easy to predict. Memory that begins quietly to change the kind of animal a human is. The new pressure on memory does not remain in memory alone. It moves into the hands, into the hearth, into the long pause between effort and reward. Once the world becomes less reliable, it is no longer enough to notice, remember, and choose well. People must also endure the gap between need and fulfillment with greater discipline. They must prepare before hunger is sharp process, before food is edible, gather before scarcity is obvious, and return to places not because something is there now, but because something can be made to last. This is where human behavior begins to shift more decisively away from immediate reaction and toward deliberate waiting. Fire sits at the center of this change, quiet and transformational. Long before it becomes symbol or technology in the grand historical sense, it is already an answer to uncertainty. Fire extends the day, drives back cold, offers protection, and makes certain places habitable that would otherwise be punishing. But perhaps its deepest effect lies in how it changes time. Raw food is immediate in one way, cooked food is delayed. The moment something is placed near flame survival, enters a brief but meaningful interval of patience. This interval matters. It trains bodies and groups to organize around process rather than instant consumption. The evidence remains incomplete on exactly how such habits shaped cognition over immense spans of time, but it is difficult to ignore how often early human life begins to depend on activities that reward waiting, coordination, and foresight. Cooking also expands what counts as food. Tough plant matter, underground storage organs, fibrous materials, marrow-rich bones, and animal tissues that would otherwise be wasteful or hard to digest can become more useful when heat time and preparation are applied. That does not simply increase calories, it broadens fallback options. In a changing world that is invaluable, a group that can make use of foods others overlook or cannot process efficiently gains resilience. One lesser-known point from archaeological and anthropological work is that food security in many traditional societies is not always built on the most glamorous or abundant foods, but on the dependable, processed, often labor-intensive ones that carry people through bad periods. The heroic hunt may command attention, but survival often rests on what can be transformed and stretched. This transformation is rarely individual. Fire pulls people into shared rhythm. Someone gathers fuel, someone watches flame, someone processes plant material, someone breaks bone, tends, embers, turns, dries, cleans, waits. Children learn by proximity. The old human pattern of cooperation now deepens around tasks whose value lies partly in their sequence. A mistake in timing can spoil effort. Too soon, food remains hard, bitter, unsafe, or nutritionally inaccessible. Too late, it burns or wastes fuel. The hearth becomes more than a source of warmth. It becomes a place where time, labor, and knowledge are coordinated. In that sense, it is a school for delayed reward. Waiting changes human behavior in ways that are easy to underestimate. Immediate return systems encourage one kind of tempo. Find, seize, eat, move on. Delayed return systems, even in modest forms, encourage another. Invest now, benefit later. Return after a pause. Preserve effort for a future need. This does not mean early humans suddenly abandon immediacy. Hunger remains real. Opportunity must still be taken when it appears. But the balance begins to shift. The more unstable the environment becomes, the more useful it is to create buffers between today's effort and tomorrow's need. Those buffers can take many forms. A known place revisited because it predictably yields fuel or raw material. A cache of useful stone or gathered resources left for return. Food dried, smoked, roasted longer, or otherwise prepared to last a little beyond the moment. A habit of carrying embers or maintaining reliable flames so that future preparation is easier and less risky. Scholars still debate how widespread and sophisticated such practices were in particular times and places, but what survives in the record suggests that the logic of buffering becomes increasingly important. The world is less forgiving, so people try wherever possible to make themselves less exposed to its swings. This is where patience stops being only a virtue of temperament and becomes an ecological skill. To wait at the right moment to hold back consumption, to preserve a portion to continue processing, when the body wants immediate reward, these are not abstractions. They are learned forms of survival. A child growing up around such practices is learning that value often lies in sequence. First collect, then prepare, then wait, then eat, first move, then assess, then commit, first save strength, then spend it where return is highest. This is a behavioral world organized not just by action, but by interval. The interval matters because it creates room for planning. Once groups begin relying more on foods and practices that require preparation, the future becomes harder to ignore. Fuel must be considered before processing. Processing must be considered before movement. Movement must be considered before nightfall or weather shift. Food gathered now may need to be divided according to likely conditions tomorrow. No single explanation fully accounts for the growth of more future-oriented human behavior, but the practical demands of fire and delayed food use offer one powerful piece of the puzzle. They force people to think in chains rather than moments. There is also a social consequence hidden inside waiting. Delayed reward often requires trust. If food is prepared for later use, others must respect that arrangement. If fuel is gathered for future cooking, someone must protect it or maintain access to it. If a group returns to a place because earlier effort invested there still matters, then memory and social cooperation must hold together across time. This is one reason delayed systems can reshape relationships. They create obligations. They create expectations. They create opportunities for conflict as well. Who gets access first? Who labored more? Who can wait? And who cannot? The record cannot speak directly on the emotional texture of such questions, but it is difficult to imagine that increasing reliance on delayed return practices did not deepen both interdependence and tension. Food sharing becomes more complicated in this context. Sharing an immediate kill is one kind of social act. Sharing processed, preserved, or carefully prepared food is another. The latter carries labor time inside it. It may also carry planning special knowledge or access to scarce fuel. This can intensify the social meaning of distribution. Care for the vulnerable may deepen, so may disputes over fairness. In unstable environments, such tensions are not signs of failure. They are signs that survival has become more structured. The simple presence of delay turns subsistence into a more layered social system. And delay does not belong only to food, it enters movement and settlement as well. People begin to endure temporary discomfort for later gain more often. They walk past a tempting but unreliable opportunity to reach a better one. They leave a place while it still offers some resources because waiting too long would endanger the next stage. They tolerate hunger a little longer to preserve a strategy. This sort of discipline postponement may not sound dramatic, but it represents a major behavioral threshold. The body's urgencies are increasingly managed by learned expectation rather than obeyed at once. One surprising implication of this shift is that boredom or something close to it may become more meaningful. Waiting near a fire, watching a slow process, remaining in one place because leaving too early would waste labour, returning to a camp or resource zone because the sequence demands it. These are moments where the human mind is not entirely occupied by immediate crisis. Such spaces may help create new conditions for teaching observation, social bonding tool maintenance, and perhaps symbolic behaviour. Scholars still debate these relationships, and the evidence is necessarily indirect, but the point remains compelling. A life with more structured waiting is also a life with more room for cumulative thought. This is why fire, food, and waiting belong together in the story. They are not separate themes. They are parts of one larger adaptation to a world that no longer rewards pure immediacy. The changing environment teaches that abundance cannot always be trusted when seen. What matters is what can be made from it, extended from it, carried through it. A root is not just a root, but a promise if processed well. A carcass is not just meat, but marrow, fat, hide bone, and stored possibility. A campsite is not just a resting place, but a node where labour today can soften danger tomorrow. Through all this, humans are not becoming less natural or less animal. They're becoming more deeply shaped by the particular pressures of their environment. The hidden change in climate and ecology has entered the tempo of daily life. It has made patience more valuable, preparation more necessary, and the future more present in every small decision. People still respond to hunger, thirst, cold, and fear, but increasingly they survive by resisting the immediate command of those sensations long enough to act on a broader pattern. And once that broader pattern is learned, it begins to alter the emotional structure of life. Anticipation grows, so does anxiety. Hope becomes tied not just to what is in sight, but to what is being prepared. Relief no longer comes only from finding food, but from knowing food can last, knowing fire can be kept, knowing return is possible. The group is learning in quiet ways to live not only from moment to moment, but from sequence to sequence. That is a profound change because later human societies will be built on exactly this principle. At larger scales, store, now eat later, labor, now survive later, build, now shelter later, plant, now harvest later. Those systems belong to a much later age, but their behavioral roots may lie here in these older adjustments around uncertain landscapes and controlled flame. Before agriculture, before granaries, before walls and ledgers, there is already a subtler revolution underway. Humans are learning to wait productively. Soon that discipline of waiting will press even deeper into social life, drawing more of survival into shared obligation, teaching protection, and long coordination across generations. But here at the hearth, the pattern is already visible. Fire burns, food changes slowly. People remain near it because remaining is wiser than rushing away. In that patient glow under pressure from a world growing harder to trust human behaviour takes another step away from immediacy and toward a future that must be prepared for before it arrives. As uncertainty deepens, no one survives alone for very long. That has always been true in some basic sense. Human beings are social long before this story begins. They raise children slowly, depend on shared labour, learn from one another and move through the world with a level of cooperation rare among large mammals. But when environments become less predictable, social life stops being merely advantageous and becomes more tightly bound to survival itself. A difficult world does not simply ask for stronger bodies or sharper senses. It asks for groups that can hold together under strain, distribute burden, and preserve knowledge even when the immediate reward for doing so is not obvious. The hidden change in the landscape now enters the social brain. It begins with a simple fact. Environmental instability produces informational inequality. Not everyone sees the same thing, remembers the same route, or understands the same risk. One person notices that birds have shifted away from a drying wetland. Another reads the tracks of game more accurately on open ground. Another remembers a distant stand of trees that still hides moisture late in the season. Another understands how long the children can travel before the pace becomes dangerous. In a stable world, these differences matter, but they may not be decisive every day. In a shifting world, they become central. A group survives not just by having knowledge, but by combining different kinds of knowledge at the right time. That need changes the value of communication. A warning must be understood quickly. A memory must be conveyed clearly enough to guide movement or restraint. A subtle sign noticed by one person has to become useful to many. Scholars still debate exactly how environmental pressure interacted with the evolution of language symbolic behavior and more complex social cognition. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for such enormous transitions. But the practical logic is hard to ignore. The more variable the world becomes, the more useful it is to share not only commands and reactions, but conditions, probabilities, exceptions, and plans. This may seem obvious from a modern perspective, but in deep prehistory it carries tremendous weight. To live in a changing world is to live increasingly inside information. Not written information, not recorded in any formal archive, but distributed across people. Who saw the herd last? Who noticed the waterline failing? Who remembers the route through higher ground? Who knows where old fire scars created new plant growth attractive to animals? A group able to pool such fragments becomes more than a cluster of bodies. It becomes a thinking system, an organism with memory spread across many minds. That shared system is never frictionless. Stress sharpens dependence, but it also sharpens conflict. In leaner conditions, every decision carries more cost. Choosing where to move, what to risk, whom to trust, when to divide labor, how much to share, whether to remain patient or act quickly. These are the kinds of choices that expose fault lines. A wrong call can mean hunger, exhaustion, or loss. The more uncertain the environment, the more likely reasonable people are to disagree. One person favors the remembered route. Another favors the nearby but dwindling opportunity. One wants caution. Another wants speed. Social intelligence under these conditions includes not only cooperation, but the management of disagreement without group collapse. This is one reason the human social brain may have been shaped not only by abundance and bonding, but by stress. Group living under pressure requires reading others with unusual precision. Who is reliable? Who is panicking? Who is hiding weakness? Who is carrying useful knowledge? Who can still endure the pace? Who needs help now in order to remain useful later? The emotional life of the group becomes more consequential, because bad tension wastes energy and time, while good coordination preserves both. One lesser known but important point from studies of hunter-gatherer behavior is that social harmony is not simply a moral preference. It is often an adaptive necessity in small interdependent groups where unresolved conflict can damage collective survival. Children sit at the center of this social pressure. Human children are unusually dependent for unusually long periods. In good conditions, that dependency is costly. In unstable conditions, it becomes a defining challenge. A group under environmental strain must somehow keep children alive while moving rationing planning and revising routes. This almost certainly increases the importance of cooperative care where responsibility is distributed beyond a single parent. Older siblings, grandparents, unrelated adults, and the group as a whole may all matter. Scholars still debate how old and how universal such alloparenting systems are in the human lineage, but the basic logic remains powerful. A species whose young are slow to mature can only thrive in unstable worlds if social support stretches wider than immediate biological ties. That wider support may also help explain why teaching becomes more central. A child protected today but poorly taught remains a future liability in a difficult environment. A child who learns how to observe, wait, carry, help, and remember becomes part of the solution. Teaching under stress is therefore not a luxury, it is an investment. And because the world is no longer stable enough for simple imitation to suffice, teaching may grow more conditional and more patient. Watch for this sign, but only trust it if another sign confirms it. Do not rush here too early. Do not waste strength on this if the ground is already too dry. These are not just instructions. They are attempts to pass on a way of thinking adapted to uncertainty. Food sharing becomes even more socially important in this context. A successful hunt or gathering episode is no longer just nutrition. It is a stabilizer for the whole group. It supports children, buys time for the injured, allows memory holders and knowledge specialists to continue contributing even when they're not the fastest or strongest, and helps prevent short-term failure from becoming fatal. Yet sharing under stress is delicate. If resources are scarce or unpredictable, generosity becomes both more necessary and more difficult. This tension may have shaped expectations around fairness, reciprocity, obligation, and reputation long before formal institutions existed. A person known for withholding may weaken future trust. A person known for reliability may gain influence even without dominance in the obvious sense. Influence itself likely changes under these conditions. Physical strength still matters, courage still matters, but foresight, memory, calm judgment, and the ability to coordinate others may matter more than before. The person who can prevent a bad decision may be more valuable than the one who can merely survive its consequences. This does not mean prehistoric groups become enlightened councils of rational planners. Stress can produce hierarchy, bullying, exclusion, or panic as easily as wisdom. What survives in the ethnographic and archaeological record suggests enormous variation. Still, if the environment increasingly rewards complex coordination, then at least some groups would have benefited from giving weight to those who can think beyond the immediate moment. Another consequence is deeper social buffering. When conditions fluctuate, an individual's survival may depend on support across time. Someone injured this week may recover if others carry the burden for a while. Someone who failed in one hunting attempt may contribute knowledge or labor later. Someone old and physically weaker may still be indispensable because they remember the rare root or the hidden water. Social systems capable of buffering temporary weakness would be more resilient than systems that reduce every member to momentary output alone. This may be one of the less visible but more important reasons humans become so powerfully cooperative. Cooperation is not just about collective action in the present. It is about carrying one another across bad intervals. That capacity likely extends beyond the smallest unit of the band. Under environmental stress, neighbouring groups become more consequential too. They may compete fiercely for narrowed resources, but they may also become sources of mates' information exchange and refuge. A world that is less stable can reward broader social networks because no one local patch is dependable forever. The evidence remains incomplete, but long-distance movement of materials and patterns of contact suggest that human groups often existed within larger webs rather than sealed isolation. This matters because wider networks act as memory reservoirs and risk-sharing systems. They expand the social brain beyond immediate camp. The emotional demands of all this should not be underestimated. To live in a world where patterns weaken is to live with more anxiety, more need for reassurance, more need to read the moods and intentions of others. Trust becomes more precious because bad trust is dangerous and good trust is life-saving. Social repair after conflict becomes more important. Humour, patience, consolation, ritualized sharing, and ordinary tenderness may all matter more than the hard archaeological record can capture. A stressed social brain is not only calculating, it is feeling constantly for the texture of safety inside a group that may be all that stands between life and exposure. One surprising implication of this is that intelligence under pressure may become increasingly social rather than purely individual. It is not enough to be clever alone if your knowledge dies with you or your temperament fractures the group. The most useful mind may be the one that can gather others into coordinated attention, preserve, calm, transmit memory, and distribute effort without wasting trust. Scholars still debate how directly ecological stress shaped these traits, but the pattern fits a broader truth of human evolution. Our species survives not just by solving problems, but by solving them together under conditions where no single person can hold the whole answer, so the hidden change continues its work. It has already altered roots, time, memory, and the value of patience. Now it presses into the group itself, tightening the bonds that matter and exposing the fractures that can kill. The social brain is being trained by a world that no longer offers easy repetition. It must become more responsive, more communicative, more tolerant of complexity, more dependent on shared burdens and distributed knowledge. That does not happen perfectly, and it does not happen the same way everywhere. Some groups fail, some harden, some scatter, some adapt brilliantly. But across these differences, a common force remains. Uncertainty is teaching humans to be more social in a deeper, more structurally necessary sense. And once social dependence reaches that level, the consequences go far beyond mere survival. A group that can preserve knowledge, share delay, care for the vulnerable, and coordinate under stress has already laid part of the foundation for everything that comes later: tradition, ritual, inheritance, obligation, and eventually the larger systems we call society. The future civilization will not appear for a very long time, but some of its deepest habits may already be alive here around a fire on a difficult route, in the tense silence before a decision in the moment one person's memory becomes everyone's chance to keep going. By the time the change becomes visible in the archaeological record, it is already old in human experience. People have been living inside it for generations, adjusting so gradually that no one could have stepped back and called it a transformation. But stone bone, ash, and sediment keep a strange kind of memory. They do not tell stories in the way later civilizations do. They do not explain motives or describe fear. They do something quieter. They preserve pattern, and when enough of those patterns are gathered across landscapes and centuries, they begin to show a species altering its behavior under pressure it never fully saw. Stone tools are among the clearest traces not because they preserve everything important, but because stone lasts when flesh speech and routine vanish. A tool is never just an object. It is a compressed decision. It reflects what kind of work mattered, what kind of material was available, how much planning went into its making, whether it was meant to be used once or carried further, whether it could be repaired, whether it served one task or several. In times and places where landscapes become less predictable, archaeologists often see signals of greater flexibility in stone use, raw materials transported farther, tools curated, longer edges, maintained more carefully, forms adapted to multiple uses rather than narrow specialization alone. Scholars still debate the meaning of particular assemblages and how directly they relate to environmental pressure, but the broader suggestion is persuasive. People are investing more thought in portability, durability, and option making. The distance stone travels matters. If a group carries high-quality material far from its source that implies something beyond convenience, it suggests that access to reliable cutting edges has become important enough to justify weight and effort. In a tightly familiar, stable range, perhaps local material is usually enough. In a more variable world, the ability to preserve capability across uncertain terrain grows more valuable. A blade or scraper is not merely a tool. It is a form of insurance. It means an animal can be processed when the chance appears. Plant material can be prepared when fallback foods become necessary. Wood can be worked into digging sticks, shafts, containers, or fire-maintaining equipment. One small object extends many possibilities. Bone tells a related story. Animal remains reveal more than diet. They reveal where effort was directed, what kinds of prey were worth pursuing, whether entire carcasses were transported or only selected parts, whether marrow was being intensively extracted, whether burning patterns suggest roasting, prolonged heating, or discard into hearth areas. A carcass broken for marrow is evidence not only of hunger, but of attention to hidden calories. Burned bone can indicate proximity to fire, repeated site use, or particular forms of processing. Cut marks on different skeletal elements can suggest whether people were taking whatever they could get in moments of scarcity, or regularly exploiting resources with increasing thoroughness. The evidence remains incomplete and interpretation is often cautious for good reason. But across many sites there is a recurring impression of humans becoming more exacting, more organized, and less wasteful. Then there are the places themselves, not grand settlements in the later sense, but repeated occupation sites, shelters, hearth zones, kill sites, processing areas, river margins, lake edges, caves, coastal middens, and open-air camps revisited often enough to matter. A site used once is an event. A site used repeatedly is part of a strategy. That distinction is crucial. Repetition suggests return, and return implies memory, timing, and expectation. Yet the nature of repeated use can also change. Some sites become more central because they offer strategic advantages under uncertainty, visibility, access to several resource zones, shelter from exposure, dependable water, good raw material nearby, or a useful position within a wider movement network. What survives in the record suggests that humans increasingly favoured places not only because they were rich, but because they were reliable enough to organise around. Fire traces deepen that impression. Hearth's ash concentrations, burned sediments, and heat-altered stone do more than confirm that humans used fire. They reveal where people chose to pause, return, process, gather, and endure. Fire leaves behind the faint outline of structured time. A hearth means more than warmth. It means stopping long enough to invest in a place. It means preparing food rather than consuming only what is immediately available. It means light protection tool maintenance and often shared attention. In some cases, repeated hearth use in the same location suggests not accidental shelter, but deliberate reoccupation. A place becomes worth holding in memory because it works across difficult conditions. Pollen seeds, phytoliths, charcoal fragments, and sediments add the environmental side of the story. They show which plants were present, how vegetation changed over time, whether landscapes were becoming more open or more wooded, wetter, or drier, more stable, or more disturbed. Lake cores and cave deposits can reveal broader climatic variability, while the archaeological layer above or below them shows how humans responded in the same general period. No single record gives a full answer. This is why scholars remain careful. Climate data may be broad, while human occupation is local. Dates may not align perfectly. Preservation differs from region to region. No single explanation fully accounts for every transition. But when environmental evidence and behavioral evidence begin moving together, the case grows stronger. A world in flux seems to coincide again and again with humans behaving in more flexible, mobile-planned and socially coordinated ways. Migration evidence complicates the picture further. Isotopes in teeth and bones can sometimes hint at movement across different landscapes. Genetic patterns much later reconstructed suggest episodes of dispersal contraction, mixing and isolation. Raw materials move, styles travel. Sometimes populations expand into newly favourable corridors. Sometimes they vanish from regions that seem to have grown harsher. Sometimes different human groups meet and overlap at ecological edges where resources compress contact. These signals do not support a neat universal timeline. Human prehistory is too regionally varied for that. But they do support a broader truth. People are not staying fixed while the world rearranges around them. They are responding dynamically, often at scales larger than older models once assumed. One lesser known but revealing clue lies in wear patterns and activity traces. Microscopic damage on tool edges can suggest cutting meat, scraping hide, working wood processing plants, or performing mixed tasks in succession. This matters because mixed task tools imply flexible behavior. If life in changing environments demands options, then tools that cross categories become especially useful. The same piece of stone may participate in several stages of survival. It is part of a general trend away from narrow certainty and toward adaptive range. Shell middens and coastal sites provide another powerful example. They often preserve evidence of repeated exploitation of shoreline resources over long spans, sometimes suggesting reliable return to rich but shifting ecological zones. Marine foods, birds, shellfish, and strand resources can provide buffers against inland instability, though only for groups that understand tide, seasonal access, and shoreline movement. When such sites appear repeatedly, they hint at sophisticated ecological knowledge shaped by long engagement with dynamic settings. The coast is not a simple fallback. It is a training ground in timing and change. Perhaps the most important lesson from all these traces is that behavior becomes visible not through one dramatic breakthrough but through clustering. More strategic site choice, more careful tool maintenance, broader use of food sources, repeated hearths, longer distance movement of materials, greater evidence of return. None of these alone proves a revolution in human thought. Together they suggest a species increasingly organized around uncertainty. Archaeology rarely lets us watch the mind directly, but it lets us watch the residue of decisions, and the residue begins to look different. There is a temptation to search for a single signature of becoming fully human, some one behavior that announces the threshold. But the record resists that simplicity. What it shows instead is layering. Practical flexibility deepens before symbolic systems fully flower. Environmental tracking intensifies before permanent settlement. Delayed return behavior appears before agriculture. Social coordination leaves its traces before hierarchy becomes visible in later forms. In other words, the transformation is cumulative. The one thing humans never fully noticed did not produce one invention. It altered the conditions under which many later human behaviors became advantageous. Even absence tells part of the story. A tool tradition that disappears from one region may indicate more than cultural drift. It may signal that the landscape supporting it has changed too much. A once-used corridor that falls silent in the record may reflect drying, flooding, ecological collapse or movement elsewhere. Empty spaces in archaeology are dangerous to interpret too confidently, but they can still matter. Sometimes what vanishes is itself a clue that the old map of human life no longer held, And through all of this, the people themselves remain invisible in the intimate sense. We do not hear the arguments over whether to leave camp early. We do not hear the warning repeated to a child near a failing water source. We do not hear the fatigue in a group deciding whether to risk the longer route. Archaeology cannot give that. What it can give is something perhaps more haunting proof that such moments accumulated. Proof that countless minor decisions preserved only in traces of stone and bone gradually changed the structure of human life. So when we look at a scatter of tools beside ancient ash or cut-marked bones, at a repeated camp or pollen revealing a drying landscape, around a sequence of occupations, we are not merely looking at survival in the simplest sense. We are looking at minds learning to hold more uncertainty groups, learning to coordinate more carefully, bodies moving through a world that has become harder to trust. The evidence remains incomplete. It always will. But enough survives to make one thing hard to deny. Human behavior was not shaped only by triumph, invention, or conscious ambition. It was also shaped by slow, environmental pressure, by the quiet breakdown of old certainties, and by the repeated need to adapt before anyone fully realized adaptation itself had become the main task. Soon the argument will widen. Was environment really the driver, or only one force among others, such as language, demography, social learning, and technology? Scholars have spent decades debating that question, and the debate matters. Because the traces in stone and bone are suggestive but never total. They point toward a hidden change. They do not close the case. And in that uncertainty, the next layer of the mystery begins. By now, the broad outline of the story seems persuasive. The world grows less stable in crucial ways. Humans respond by becoming more flexible, more future-oriented, more dependent on memory cooperation, and delayed reward. Stone and bone preserve hints of that adjustment. Landscapes and paleoclimate records suggest the pressure behind it. It is a strong narrative, perhaps too strong if left unquestioned. Because once a pattern becomes convincing, there is a risk of letting it explain more than the evidence can bear. And this is where scholars become careful. The hidden change may have altered everything, but whether it did so as the main cause, or only as one force among several, remains deeply debated. Environmental pressure is compelling because it is large, measurable, and often brutally practical. If water shifts, if prey changes route, if seasonality becomes less predictable, then behavior has to move with it or break against it. That much is almost unavoidable. But humans are not passive instruments played by climate. They are cultural, social, inventive creatures even very early in their story. A world can create pressure without dictating a single response. Two groups facing similar environmental stress may behave quite differently depending on population density, prior knowledge, neighboring contacts, available materials, and the social systems already in place. No single explanation fully accounts for why one population becomes more innovative in a given setting, while another becomes more conservative, fragments, or disappears. One major line of argument places language closer to the center. In this view, the real transformation lies not primarily in environmental instability, but in the growth of increasingly precise communication. Once humans can transmit more complex information, name places more reliably, preserve longer chains of instruction, and discuss absent things or future risks, many other changes become easier to imagine. Planning improves, teaching deepens, memory becomes more collective and less dependent on repeated direct experience. Cooperation scales more effectively. Under this interpretation, changing climates may provide context, but language is the decisive engine. The problem, of course, is that language leaves no simple fossil. Scholars infer its growth indirectly through anatomy, cognition, symbolism, and behavior, which makes the debate difficult to settle cleanly. Another explanation emphasizes demography. Perhaps the key change is not the environment alone, but the number and distribution of humans. Larger or more interconnected populations preserve innovation better. A useful behavior discovered in one group is less likely to vanish if there are many people to maintain, copy, and refine it. Smaller, isolated populations can lose knowledge through death, drift, or bad luck. In that sense, what looks like a cognitive or environmental revolution may partly reflect population thresholds. Once enough humans exist in enough contact with one another, new behaviors accumulate more reliably. Environmental shifts may still matter, perhaps even by forcing movement and contact, but they are no longer the sole author of change. They become one participant in a wider system. There is also a technological argument. Perhaps tools fire use containers, clothing hafting, and other practical innovations gradually change the cost structure of survival so profoundly that behavior would have shifted even without strong environmental pressure. A better cutting edge, a more dependable fire system improved food, processing or carrying technology now lost from the record, any of these could widen the zone of livable conditions and encourage planning, sharing, or delayed return. Under this view, humans may not simply be responding to an uncertain world, they may be creating a new form of life through cumulative technical skill, with climate acting as a background challenge rather than the main mover. Social complexity offers another possibility. Perhaps the most important force is not environment, language, demography, or technology by itself, but the internal dynamics of human groups. Competition for status, sexual selection, childcare demands, intergroup alliances, ritual behavior, imitation, reputation, and emotional dependence may all have pushed humans toward deeper cooperation and cognition, regardless of climate. The social brain hypothesis, in its broadest form, suggests that managing relationships in complex groups can itself drive major behavioral transformation. Under that model, environmental variability may sharpen certain pressures, but much of the decisive change is happening inside the social world. Humans build around one another. These explanations are not mutually exclusive, which is both the strength and frustration of the debate. Climate may create instability. Instability may reward better communication. Better communication may preserve innovation. Larger populations may spread that innovation more effectively. Social complexity may determine whether cooperation holds under stress. Technology may soften some pressures while amplifying the value of planning in others. Once the system is seen this way, the search for one cause begins to look too narrow. The evidence remains incomplete not only because the past is distant, but because multiple forces may be interacting at once. Still, environmental explanations retain unusual power because they connect so many practical changes at once. If old patterns of abundance become less dependable, then planning, memory, communication, social buffering, and technology all become more valuable together. Climate does not have to explain everything directly in order to matter profoundly. It may function more like a field of pressure than a single trigger. It alters the conditions under which certain traits pay off. In a stable world, some abilities remain useful but not decisive. In a less stable one, the same abilities become central to survival. That distinction helps resolve part of the debate. The environment may not create intelligence, language, or cooperation from nothing. It may instead make them more necessary, more rewarded, and harder to do without. One lesser-known aspect of this scholarly argument concerns pace. Some researchers imagine long gradual accumulation. Others point to bursts or pulses, periods in which environmental variability, contact innovation, or symbolic behavior seem to intensify more rapidly. These models need not cancel one another. A long background trend may be punctuated by thresholds. Humans can absorb pressure slowly for ages, then cross a point where previously marginal behaviors suddenly matter much more. A slightly more variable climate, a slightly denser population, and a slightly improved capacity for teaching might together produce change that looks abrupt in the archaeological record even if its roots are old. There is also the question of regional difference. A theory that seems convincing in one landscape may fail badly in another. Coastal groups may respond to change differently from inland groups. Riverine systems may provide buffers unavailable in dry grasslands. Woodland mosaics may reward broad-spectrum foraging in ways open plains do not. A behavior that appears to be driven by scarcity in one region may emerge under relative abundance in another, because abundance itself allows experimentation. Scholars still debate these regional contrasts intensely and with good reason. Human history is too distributed to be forced into a single ecological script. This is why caution matters. It is easy to turn environmental pressure into a master story that flattens human creativity. It is equally easy to overcorrect and treat climate as background scenery, while celebrating language symbolism or social intelligence in isolation. The truth is likely less satisfying and more intricate. Humans are shaped by worlds they do not choose, but they also reshape the meaning of those worlds through culture, memory, and invention. A drying corridor can mean collapse for one group and opportunity for another. A coast made rich by ecological change can become a refuge if people know how to use it. The same pressure does not produce the same future everywhere. Even so, the debate itself teaches something important. The question is no longer whether slow, nearly invisible change can alter human behavior. That much is hard to deny. The real question is how such change interacts with the rest of what humans are: social, imitative, communicative, tool-using, emotionally interdependent and capable of cumulative knowledge. The environment may be the opening force, the silent editor of old certainties. But what fills the new space it creates depends on everything else humans bring with them. Perhaps that is why the hidden change is so difficult to isolate. It does not leave a signature labeled cause. It leaves pressure. Pressure on food timing, pressure on route reliability, pressure on memory, pressure on cooperation, pressure on the transmission of knowledge. Some groups answer that pressure through stronger social systems, others through mobility, others through technical adaptation, others through a mixture of all three. When scholars argue over the driver, they are often really arguing over which level of the system deserves the most weight. And there is another complication. Once a behavior becomes established, it can outlast the conditions that first favored it. A group that learns to plan more deeply in a volatile environment may continue planning that way, even if local stability returns. A culture built around delayed reward may preserve that pattern because it works socially, not merely ecologically. Knowledge-sharing systems may grow self-reinforcing. In that sense, the original pressure can disappear while its behavioral legacy remains. This makes the archaeological record even harder to interpret. A later pattern may reflect an earlier cause no longer visible in the local environment. So the competing explanations do not weaken the story so much as deepen it. They remind us that humans do not change because one external force pushes a simple button. They change because multiple pressures converge on a species already capable of learning, sharing, inventing, and remembering. The quiet environmental shift may be one of the most powerful forces in that convergence, precisely because it never works alone. It makes other capacities more valuable. It turns latent abilities into necessary ones. It forces choices that reveal which behaviors can carry life through uncertainty. That is why no honest telling of this history can claim certainty where the evidence does not allow it. Scholars still debate the weight of climate against language of demography, against symbolism of technology, against social complexity. The evidence remains incomplete, sometimes maddeningly so. But uncertainty does not erase the shape of the problem. It sharpens it. Humans become different in ways that are cumulative, practical, and profound. The world around them is changing. Their inner world is changing. Their group life is changing. Their tools, timing, memory, and teaching are changing. The question is not whether these things are connected. The question is how tightly, how unevenly, and in which order. And that debate matters because it prevents the story from becoming too simple. The one thing humans never noticed may not have acted alone. It may have been the silent partner in a larger transformation, the pressure that made language more useful, made teaching more urgent, made cooperation more expensive to lose, made innovation harder to discard, made memory heavier to carry. If so, then the hidden change did not replace other causes. It joined them, strengthened them, and gave them consequence. What follows from that is unsettling in a different way. If behavior changes through converging pressures rather than singular events, then success itself may carry hidden costs. The same flexibility that helps humans survive unstable worlds may lead them toward deeper dependence on systems that later become fragile in their own right. The adaptations that solve one problem may quietly create the next. And once that begins, the story is no longer only about survival. It becomes a story about the price of becoming so good at adapting that adaptation itself starts building traps. The behaviors that help humans survive a less reliable world do not remain temporary for long. That is one of the strangest patterns in deep history. A response born from pressure hardens into routine. Routine gathers expectation. Expectation becomes teaching. Teaching becomes inheritance. And inheritance repeated across enough generations begins to look less like adaptation and more like the natural order of life. What started as practical adjustment to uncertainty slowly becomes culture. This is not culture in the narrow decorative sense of symbols placed on top of survival. It is culture in the older, heavier sense, the shared habits by which a group organizes time, effort, trust space, and memory. Once people begin planning more carefully, returning to strategic places, sharing delayed resources depending on distributed knowledge, and teaching children how to read unstable conditions, they are already living inside structures that extend beyond instinct. These structures do not need writing monuments or formal law to matter. They exist in what is expected, who carries what, who watches fire, who remembers alternate routes, who decides when waiting has become too dangerous, who receives food first when a return is uncertain, who is trusted to notice subtle signs. These patterns may begin as necessities, but repeated necessity is one of culture's deepest foundations. A group facing environmental instability cannot afford to rediscover everything from scratch in each generation. The cost would be too high. Knowledge must be stabilized not because the world itself is stable, but because people need durable ways to deal with instability. This is the paradox. The more unpredictable the environment becomes, the more humans depend on stable systems of memory instruction and social expectation. In other words, culture may grow denser, not in spite of uncertainty, but because of it. Consider what happens when a route becomes conditional rather than fixed. At first, people may simply explain the condition as they move. Only go this way after late rain. Avoid the lower crossing when the season warms too early. Check the upland pool before committing to the longer path. Over time, such guidance is repeated often enough that it becomes part of the moral and practical education of the young. Children are not merely taught where to go. They are taught how to judge whom to trust, when to hesitate, when not to. The landscape is no longer learned as a series of facts. It is learned as a disciplined way of paying attention. That discipline is culture. Food practices change in the same direction. A group that depends increasingly on processing, sharing, and delayed consumption cannot function through appetite alone. It needs sequence. Gather first, preserve fuel, cook thoroughly, keep a portion for later. Divide according to need, seniority, contribution, or some blend of all three. The exact arrangement would vary from one population to another, and scholars still debate how such norms crystallized in early human societies. But what survives in ethnographic comparison strongly suggests that subsistence is never just technical. It is moralized. It carries judgments about patience, fairness, obligation, and competence. Once those judgments become regular, they begin to shape behavior even when immediate conditions do not force them. A child learns not merely how to eat, but how to belong through eating. This may be one of the most important thresholds in the whole story. An adaptation ceases to be merely situational once it becomes socially enforceable. If the group expects planning, then impulsiveness becomes dangerous in a different way. If the group expects sharing, then hoarding becomes more than selfishness. It becomes a threat to system stability. If the group expects attention to elders' memory or to designated specialists in certain tasks, then ignoring them risks not only error but social rupture. What began as a collection of useful behaviors becomes a framework of norms. Norms also help solve a problem that grows more serious under instability, uncertainty inside the group itself. When the environment is unreliable, people need some reliability somewhere. Shared expectations create that reliability. They do not eliminate conflict, but they make cooperation less costly by reducing constant negotiation. Who gathers fuel? Who watches children during processing? Who takes the first risk scouting a new area? Who stays near the weak or injured? Who gets the best information first? These arrangements may not be equal or gentle, but they create predictability within a world that has less of it outside. Culture becomes an internal shelter. One lesser-known point from anthropological thinking is that ritual may partly emerge from this same need. Ritual is often treated as something separate from subsistence, something symbolic or spiritual added later. But repeated formalized action can also stabilize coordination under uncertainty. A shared sequence before movement, before food division, before return to a significant place, before handling the dead, before entering a risky season, such practices can reinforce memory, reduce anxiety, and make group behavior more coherent. The evidence remains incomplete for how deep into prehistory such formalization extends in any clear way, but the underlying logic is powerful. Humans facing variable conditions may develop not only better tools and better planning, but better patterned behavior. Patterned behavior carries emotional force as well. In an unstable world, repeated custom offers reassurance. The fire is built this way. The route is checked in this order. The young are taught by these people. The food is divided according to this logic. The group pauses here before crossing. These are not only practical acts, they are ways of making uncertainty feel survivable. Habit reduces mental load. Shared habit reduces fear. Over many generations, people may no longer remember which parts of these customs arose from acute need and which from older inheritance. They simply know that this is how life is done. This is how adaptation becomes identity. A people known for careful timing, for long memory of routes, for strategic use of coasts, for particular ways of processing food, for broad sharing, for strict instruction of children, for specialized ecological knowledge. Such traits may begin as responses to local conditions, but eventually they help define the group itself. They become part of belonging. To act otherwise is not merely inefficient, it is alien. Culture does not erase the environmental roots of behavior, but it can conceal them. What began as a solution to instability is now protected because it feels right, ancestral, proper. At the same time, culture preserves more than practical skill. It preserves perception. Once a group repeatedly teaches children to notice certain signs and ignore others, to trust certain patterns and doubt others, the environment is no longer raw reality. It is filtered through inherited attention. Two groups can share a broad region and still live in different cognitive landscapes because their cultures tell them where meaning lies. One may specialize in reading animal behavior, another in plant timing, another in coastal cycles, another in hidden water. The changing world does not merely force humans to adapt, it diversifies how they adapt, and culture is the mechanism that stores those differences. Yet cultural stability introduces its own tension. If the environment keeps changing, then norms that once preserved life can become traps. A route sanctified by tradition may no longer be the best one. A food practice optimized for older conditions may waste effort under new ones. A social role once crucial may become less useful while still retaining prestige. This is one reason no single explanation fully accounts for human success. Culture is powerful because it stores adaptation, but it's also conservative because stored adaptation can outlast its usefulness. The same inherited system that gives a group resilience can also slow revision when the world shifts again. That tension may help explain why some human populations appear extraordinarily successful for long spans, then suddenly vulnerable. Their practices worked until they did not, or rather they continued partly working while the conditions that had made them so effective were sliding away. This is one of history's quiet cruelties. The more successful an adaptation has been, the harder it can be to question. Confidence grows around what has preserved life. Confidence turns into custom. Custom turns into identity. Identity resists change even when change has already begun outside it. Still, across the larger arc of prehistory, culture is overwhelmingly a gain. It allows humans to carry solutions farther than genetics ever could on its own timescale. It lets one generation inherit not only bodies shaped by the past, but behavior shaped by remembered success. It makes cumulative adaptation possible. A child does not start from zero. A child starts inside thousands of decisions, already made durable by repetition. This is one of the deepest reasons humans become such a powerful species. They do not merely adapt individually, they adapt collectively across time, and that collective continuity may be the true legacy of the hidden change. Once environmental uncertainty pushes humans toward memory planning, patience coordination, and shared norms, the door opens to larger cultural systems later on. Not immediately, not neatly. But the underlying machinery is already there. The future farmer storing grain, the navigator following inherited coasts the elder, recalling famine signs, the craft specialist preserving technique, the priest safeguarding sequence, the ruler enforcing distribution, all belong to much later worlds. Yet they depend on the same foundational truth: useful behavior can be made to persist beyond the moment that first created it. So when adaptation becomes culture, something decisive has happened. The human response to instability is no longer only flexible, it is transmissible. It can survive the death of individuals. It can shape children who never experienced the original crisis that produced it. It can guide action in new places under altered skies across different generations. And because culture carries old solutions forward, it can also carry old assumptions forward, setting the stage for both future success and future fragility. That is where the story darkens again. For every behavior that helps humans endure a changing world, there is a cost hidden inside success. Planning can become dependence. Sharing can become hierarchy. Stored knowledge can become rigid authority. Strategic return can become territorial fixation. Patience can become vulnerability when delay is no longer possible. The same structures that make humans resilient can also narrow the range of futures they can survive. And once that narrowing begins, adaptation stops being only a triumph. It becomes the beginning of a trap. Success always carries a shadow. The habits that savour people under one set of pressures can bind them under the next. This is one of the most unsettling truths in the long human story. Adaptation feels like victory while it is working. It brings relief, continuity, and survival. The group learns to plan further ahead. Remember more, share, more carefully invest in delayed return trust. Certain routes, value certain specialists, and preserve useful customs. These achievements make life more resilient in an unstable world. But resilience is not the same thing as freedom. The more tightly survival depends on learned systems, the more dangerous it becomes when those systems are strained, broken, or made obsolete by new conditions. Planning is an obvious example. In a variable landscape, planning is indispensable. It helps people move before scarcity becomes crisis, preserve effort, and distribute resources more wisely. But planning also creates dependence on forecasts, routines, and expectations. A group that survives by reading patterns very well can become more vulnerable when patterns shift beyond the range those skills were built to manage. The better one is at anticipating a familiar kind of uncertainty, the harder it can be to recognize a new kind. This is one reason no single explanation fully accounts for collapse in later human systems. Failure often comes not from ignorance, but from competence fitted too precisely to conditions that no longer hold. Sharing carries the same paradox. Greater social dependence helps humans absorb bad seasons, protect the vulnerable, and preserve valuable knowledge. Yet a society built on sharing also has to decide who gives, who receives, who decides, and who is trusted. Those decisions can harden into hierarchy. A person who controls information about route, seasons, or stored resources gains unusual leverage. A group that must coordinate closely under pressure may begin rewarding obedience more than experimentation. Norms that once preserved mutual survival can become mechanisms of inequality, exclusion, or coercion. The archaeological record for such deep phases is necessarily limited, but the logic is familiar across many historical settings. Systems built to manage scarcity often produce both cooperation and power. Memory too has a cost. Long memory saves lives when it preserves rare but essential knowledge. But stored memory often becomes authority, and authority can resist correction. If elder specialists or inherited custom insist that the old route is still best, or that the old timing still holds, the group may cling too long to a failing system. Memory does not merely preserve solutions, it preserves confidence in those solutions. When the environment shifts gradually, that confidence can outlast reality by generations. The same social respect that once helped a people survive can make revision painfully slow. What survives in the record suggests that human communities often balance reverence for inherited knowledge with the need for adjustment, but the balance is fragile. Too little memory is disastrous. Too much loyalty to memory can be disastrous as well. Return to strategic places reveals another hidden cost. In uncertain landscapes, repeated return is wise. It anchors movement, preserves familiarity, and allows effort to accumulate. But over time, strategic return can become territorial fixation. A valley, a spring, a river bend a shellfish coast. A migration corridor may shift from being one useful option among several to being central to group identity and survival. Once that happens, flexibility narrows. Losing access to the place no longer means merely finding another route. It means social dislocation, emotional rupture, and practical crisis all at once. Place becomes heavier. It gathers memory, obligation, and belonging. That depth is a strength, until the place itself changes, dries, floods, erodes, or becomes contested. This is where adaptation begins to build traps. Not because humans are foolish, but because every successful system creates commitments. A group that learns to use a rich but variable coastline becomes invested in coastal timing, coastal food, coastal movement, coastal identity. A group organized around long-range seasonal return becomes invested in maintaining those routes and the social knowledge surrounding them. A group whose success depends on specialists in planning, tracking, storing, or teaching becomes dependent on social arrangements that preserve those roles. The more intricate the system, the more it can achieve. The more intricate the system, the more points at which it can fail. One lesser known but important principle in resilience theory is that systems optimized for one kind of variability can become brittle when variability changes form. A community capable of surviving recurring drought may still fail under repeated abrupt swings between flood and dryness. A population skilled at broad mobility may still struggle if corridors close because of other humans rather than climate. A group that thrives through delayed return food strategies may still collapse if the resources supporting delay disappear faster than social habits can adjust. In other words, adaptation is never universal. It is fitted, and fitted systems can tear. Human success may therefore contain the seeds of later fragility. Once people become better at extracting value from difficult environments, they can support more children, preserve more knowledge, return more efficiently, and depend more deeply on structured cooperation. All of that strengthens them. It can also reduce slack. A tightly coordinated group often runs lean. There is less waste, less redundancy, less room for individual improvisation outside the shared system. When that system is stressed, everyone feels it quickly. This is not yet civilization in the later sense, but the pattern is already visible. Increased behavioral sophistication often means increased systemic dependence. Children, again, stand near the center of this process. A culture rich in conditional knowledge, delayed reward, and structured cooperation can raise highly capable adults. It can also lengthen the period of learning required to become competent. The more survival depends on subtle memory and social skill, the more costly childhood becomes. Human childhood is already unusually long. Under growing behavioral complexity, that long dependence becomes even more significant. The group must invest heavily in the young, not just physically but cognitively and socially. This investment pays off, but it also ties future success to uninterrupted transmission. If the chain of teaching breaks, the loss can be severe. Social trust grows heavier too. In a more complex survival system, betrayal or failure matters more because the stakes are layered. If one person neglects fire maintenance, that may affect food, warmth, and safety all at once. If someone hoards in a delayed return system, they do not merely take more than their share. They undermine the logic of future cooperation. If specialists lose credibility, decision-making fragments at exactly the moment coherence is needed. This increased significance of trust makes humans stronger in groups, but also more exposed to social fracture. Tension that once might have been survivable becomes systemic. There is also the hidden cost of success in expanding into marginal or changing environments. Humans who become better planners, better sharers, better users of fire, and better readers of mixed landscapes can occupy places that earlier conditions might have made too risky. This is a triumph, but it also places them closer to ecological edges where a further shift can be devastating. In effect, behavioral success can lure populations into deeper dependence on fragile opportunity. A corridor opens, a coast enriches, a drying plain remains usable, because memory and timing are excellent. A cold zone becomes livable, because fire and clothing and cooperation hold. Yet every such gain can later become a liability if the conditions supporting it move again. Scholars still debate how far back this pattern should be projected, and how strongly it applies before agriculture, but the basic logic is hard to resist. Humans become more resilient by building systems. Systems create dependence. Dependence narrows response when change outruns adjustment. The same species that survived by noticing more, remembering more, sharing more, and waiting more may eventually suffer because all those strengths are entangled with expectations that no longer match the world. This may be why so many later collapses from local abandonments to major civilizational failures feel strangely familiar. The scale changes. Cities rise, states appear, farming spreads, hierarchies harden, writing records the strain. But underneath the later drama lies an older structure. People build stability in response to uncertainty. Then they come to depend on the stability they built. Then new uncertainty arrives. The trap is not adaptation itself. The trap is mistaking adaptation for permanence, and permanence is exactly what the ancient hidden change never allowed. The world that trained humans into deeper planning and cooperation did so by withdrawing certainty. Yet once those behaviors became culture, humans naturally began using them to create local certainty. Again, certainty in custom, in place, in authority, in stored knowledge, in coordinated effort. They built islands of order inside larger instability. That was necessary. It was brilliant. It was also dangerous because the larger instability never truly went away. So the hidden cost of success is not simply inequality, rigidity, or tension, though all of those can grow from it. The deeper cost is illusion. The illusion that because a system has worked, it will keep working. The illusion that because memory preserved life once, memory alone can preserve it again. The illusion that because a place sustained generations, it is therefore owed permanence. The illusion that social coordination once achieved guarantees safety. Human beings do not invent these illusions out of vanity. They inherit them from success itself. By this point in the story, the great unnoticed transformation has done something remarkable and uneasy at once. It has made humans more capable than ever of surviving fluctuation, and in doing so, it has made them capable of building ways of life that feel stable enough to trust deeply. That trust will become the basis of later societies, later abundance, later achievements. It will also make later shocks more devastating when they come. The behaviors forged to survive uncertainty have begun quietly to manufacture new kinds of vulnerability. That is why the path ahead leads naturally towards civilization. Not because civilization was inevitable, and not because one climate shift secretly invented cities, but because the habits now embedded in human life, planning, storing, teaching, coordinating, returning, honoring inherited knowledge, organizing delayed reward are exactly the habits from which larger systems can grow. Once those systems appear, the old hidden change will still be there underneath them, shaping the way humans respond to stress, risk, memory, and loss. The future will look new, its foundations will be ancient. When the first civilizations appear, they look like a new kind of world. Fields are measured, water is diverted, grain is stored, walls rise, labor is organized, power settles into institutions, priests keep sequence, administrators count, rulers claim order over land and people alike. Compared with the old mobile lives of deep prehistory, this seems like a complete break, the triumph of settled complexity over the uncertainty of earlier existence. But the deeper one looks, the less complete that break becomes. Many of the basic habits that make civilization possible are not born with cities. They are much older. They were forged long before writing, long before kings, long before the first permanent fields in the Long Era, when humans were learning to survive a world that no longer repeated itself cleanly. Agriculture is the most obvious example. Farming looks like a radical invention, and in one sense it is. To plant now for harvest later, to depend on managed growth, to remain near land through changing seasons, to store grain against future hunger, these are extraordinary commitments. But they do not emerge from nowhere. They depend on ways of thinking already familiar in older forms. Delayed reward, careful seasonal timing, memory of place, return to strategic locations, social coordination, food management, instruction across generations, none of these begin with farming. Farming intensifies them. It formalizes them. It locks them to land and to larger populations. What had once been adaptive behavior for moving through uncertainty becomes the permanent operating logic of settled life. Storage makes the continuity especially clear. A granary is in one sense something entirely new. It concentrates future survival in a visible structure. Yet the mental world behind it is ancient. It rests on the same principle that once governed fire, processed food, and careful waiting preserve now so that tomorrow does not destroy you. The scale changes dramatically, but the habit is familiar. A species trained by variability to think in intervals is ready eventually to build entire societies around intervals. Seed time and harvest, tax and redistribution, scarcity and reserve, debt and obligation. Civilization turns ancient behavioral lessons into institutions. Water management reveals the same inheritance. Irrigation channels, wells, levees, reservoirs, seasonal flood use. These later systems appear highly technical, and they are. But their foundation is older than engineering. It lies in the intense human sensitivity to water as organizer of movement and survival. Long before canals, people already understood that water determined routes, timing, vulnerability, and opportunity. Long before bureaucracies measured flow groups were already making life and death decisions around springs, wetlands, river crossings, and seasonal pools. Civilizations do not invent the importance of water. They amplify it, formalize it, and make larger populations depend on its successful control. The same is true of social coordination. States may command labor at scales no foraging group ever could, but the underlying requirement is not new. To build ditches, harvest fields, defend stores, manage seasonal work, and care for the dependent requires coordinated action across time. That capacity has deep roots in older worlds where survival already depended on sharing distributed memory, cooperative childcare, and group response to fluctuating conditions. What changes with civilization is not the existence of coordination, but its scale, its rigidity, and its embedding in hierarchy. Roles that may once have been fluid or situational can become fixed. Obligation becomes enforceable. Authority becomes durable beyond the memory of a single generation. One lesser known but telling continuity lies in the social value of specialists. In earlier worlds, the specialist may be the tracker, the keeper of rare root knowledge, the person who knows hidden water, the one skilled in complex processing, the elder who remembers exceptional seasons. In civilization, the specialist may be the irrigator, the measurer, the ritual expert, the record keeper, the grain manager. The title changes, the principle remains. Human survival increasingly depends on knowledge that is not evenly distributed, and societies increasingly organize themselves around preserving, controlling, and legitimizing that knowledge. Place attachment also deepens rather than beginning anew. Settled societies appear rooted in land in a way mobile ones are not, but that contrast can be misleading. Earlier humans already built emotional and practical worlds around strategic places. Springs, coasts, river margins, migration corridors, caves, ridges, repeated camp zones. These were not blank coordinates. They were remembered, valued, and revisited. Agriculture and settlement do not create human attachment to place from nothing. They intensify it until it becomes infrastructural. The cost of losing a place rises enormously. A failed field, a salinized irrigation zone, a diverted river, a dried marsh, an eroded terrace, a flood-damaged storehouse. These are later versions of a very old problem when survival is tied closely to a known place change becomes more dangerous. And that danger is where the oldest continuity of all reappears. Civilizations look like monuments to control, but they are still responses to uncertainty. They gather people, labor, food, and belief into systems meant to stabilize life against a world that remains changeable. A city wall is a promise against threat. A granary is a promise against hunger. A canal is a promise against unreliable rain. A calendar is a promise against missed timing. Ritual is a promise against disorder. Administration is a promise that memory can be externalized into records and procedures rather than carried only in living minds. These are astonishing achievements, but they are still at base adaptive structures built against instability. That is why the first civilizations remain haunted by the same pressures that shaped deeper human behavior. Drought can still break them. Flood can still overwhelm them. Seasonal failure can still expose how thin their margins are. Administrators may count grain, but grain can fail. Priests may mark sacred time, but climate does not obey ceremony. Kings may claim dominion, but rivers migrate and soils tire. Scholars still debate the precise causes of many early collapses and regional abandonments, and no single explanation fully accounts for them. Yet again and again the same pattern returns. A system built to create certainty is destabilized by forces that remain partly beyond control. The scale is different from prehistory. The logic is hauntingly familiar. This is why early civilization should not be imagined as an escape from the ancient hidden change. It is better understood as one of its grandest consequences. Once humans learn to plan, deeply preserve food, share delayed returns, trust inherited systems, invest in children over long dependency, coordinate labor, and honor stored knowledge, the path toward larger settled systems became possible. Not inevitable, but possible. Civilization is one answer to uncertainty, perhaps the boldest one humans ever attempted. It says in effect that instead of moving through a variable world, people will organize enough collective effort to reshape part of that world in their favor. For a time and often for generations, this works magnificently. Fields yield. Surpluses support specialists. Ritual and rule produce continuity. Infrastructure reduces some risks that once dominated daily life. Population grows. Memory leaves the body and enters stone, clay, tale, story, and lore. Human beings seem to have escaped the narrow improvisation of older existence. But the success carries the ancient cost. The more effective the system, the more people depend on it. The more land is fixed into one use, the less mobility remains. The more authority is concentrated, the more fragile failure can become when leaders misjudge. The more food is centralized, the greater the consequences of local collapse. Civilization magnifies both resilience and brittleness. Agriculture, too, carries the old trap in a sharper form. It stabilizes food under some conditions while tying populations to narrow ecological expectations. A foraging group facing local decline may move, diversify, or scatter. A farming settlement cannot always do so without catastrophic loss. Investment in fields, walls, irrigation, and storage creates a different kind of vulnerability. It rewards staying. It punishes leaving. It turns delayed reward into a system so large that its breakdown affects thousands rather than dozens. The same ancient human strength commitment to planned futures becomes the basis of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary exposure. What survives in the record of early civilizations often looks surprisingly like the final enlarged expression of behaviors shaped far earlier. Hierarchies of knowledge, managed delay, moralized distribution, seasonal discipline, territorial investment, dependence on shared memory, anxiety about order, repeated attempts to stabilize risk through custom and control. The names change, the technologies change, the social scale becomes immense, but the behavioral architecture is older than the cities themselves. This is why the rise of civilization is not only a story of invention, it is also a story of inheritance. The farmer inherits from the forager a mind already trained to watch seasons carefully. The village inherits a long tradition of return and attachment to strategic places. The storehouse inherits the logic of preserving food against uncertain futures. Authority inherits the old prestige of those who remembered rare and useful things. Ritual inherits patterned action, used to make cooperation durable under stress. Even inequality may inherit something from much older asymmetries in access to knowledge, coordination, and control of delayed resources. Civilization is new, but it is built from old human materials, and because of that, the ancient unnoticed shift does not end when cities rise. It simply becomes harder to see. It disappears behind architecture, law, cosmology, and political power. People start telling themselves different stories about why their world works. They speak of gods, kings, ancestors, prosperity, order, destiny. Beneath those stories, however, the same deep behavioral inheritance continues to operate. Humans still fear scarcity. They still organize around delayed reward. They still depend on transmitted knowledge. They still struggle to distinguish stability from temporary success. They still build systems that feel permanent in order to survive a world that is not. So the first civilizations are not a departure from the deeper story. They are its most dramatic extension. The one thing humans never fully noticed, the slow erosion of certainty, the gradual need to plan, remember, wait, coordinate, and preserve, may have done more than shape prehistoric survival. It may have prepared the human species for the grandest gamble of all, building entire societies on the belief that uncertainty could be managed if enough labor memory and trust were organized in one place. And for a while that gamble changes the world, but it never changes the underlying truth. The habits born from adaptation still carry their hidden cost. What made civilization possible also made civilization fragile. The ancient lesson remains buried inside the new achievement, waiting to reappear whenever the landscape shifts. The rains fail, the stores thin, or the old systems can no longer explain the ground beneath them. The strangest part of the story is that it may not be over. The ancient change was never only about climate in the narrow technical sense, never only about shifting rain or moving coastlines or drying plains. It was about what happens to human behavior when the background stops being trustworthy. It was about the long education of a species under conditions that could not be mastered, only tracked, remembered, negotiated, and endured. If that education truly helped shape the human way of planning, fearing, storing, sharing, teaching, and building, then its deepest legacy is not buried in some lost valley or drowned shoreline. It is alive now inside ordinary modern behavior so familiar that it barely feels historical at all. Look closely at what human beings still do. They stockpile against futures they cannot see clearly. They build routines to contain uncertainty. They trust systems that have worked before, even when the systems are beginning to fail at the edges. They turn memory into infrastructure records, maps, institutions, traditions, algorithms, forecasts, archives. They assign authority to those who claim to understand changing conditions. They teach children not only facts, but how to anticipate risk, how to delay gratification, how to navigate invisible threats. They become anxious when patterns weaken. They become deeply attached to places, methods, and explanations that once kept them safe. None of this proves a direct, unbroken line from prehistory to the present in any simple way. Scholars would rightly resist a story that's smooth. But the resemblance is difficult to ignore. The old adaptation may still be guiding the human mind. Modern life often congratulates itself for having escaped environmental dependence, yet the emotional architecture says otherwise. Markets rise and fall, and people respond with hoarding caution, trust in specialists, suspicion of failing signals, sudden rushes back toward basic needs. Weather grows erratic, and whole societies rediscover how thin the line is between confidence and improvisation. Supply chains break, and highly advanced populations behave in ways that would be instantly recognizable to much older humans. Preserve what matters. Share selectively, identify fallback routes, seek reliable information, cling to routine, search for blame, search for order. The technologies are different. The nervous system beneath them may be less different than people like to believe. One lesser known but revealing point from behavioral research is how quickly humans revert to short-term security strategies when uncertainty rises, even in wealthy and highly structured societies. They buy more than they immediately need. They focus on essentials. They narrow trust. They value predictive authority more intensely. They become more attentive to weak signals, though not always more accurate in interpreting them. In other words, the old tension between planning and fear, between stored knowledge and present volatility, remains close to the surface. It does not need to be reinvented. It is already there. This ancient inheritance may also help explain one of the most persistent contradictions in human civilization. People crave stability, but they also adapt to instability with extraordinary speed. They build systems meant to last, then become restless or panicked when those systems no longer fit changing conditions. They preserve tradition because it carries the memory of survival, yet they also prize innovation when old routines fail. They centralize knowledge, then distrust it when the world stops matching its promises. They settle, store, classify, and regulate, while also carrying a deep behavioral readiness for disruption. No single explanation fully accounts for this tension, but it makes sense if modern humans are still living inside strategies forged in a world where certainty kept eroding. The legacy appears in politics and power as well. Societies repeatedly elevate those who promise to manage uncertainty through order control, forecasting, storage borders, law, ritual technology, or force. That pattern is ancient. In unstable conditions, confidence becomes a resource. The person or institution claiming to read the signs, remember the rare root, preserve the store, or coordinate the group gains influence. Later, civilizations turn this into kingship, priesthood, administration, and bureaucracy. Modern societies translate it into other forms, but the behavioral root may be the same. Humans still search for stabilizers when the background feels unreliable. Even everyday domestic life carries echoes. Pantry shelves, emergency savings calendars, weather apps, childcare routines, long education insurance systems, maintenance schedules, backup plans, social networks that can be relied on in crisis. These are not prehistoric behaviors in any literal sense, but they rhyme with them. They are all ways of pushing security forward in time of refusing to live only in the present moment, of creating buffers between immediate conditions and future danger. The old lesson remains: survival belongs not just to the strong, but to the prepared. Yet the trap remains too. The more intricate the system, the more people depend on it. The more a society succeeds at creating stability, the harder it becomes to adapt when stability fails in a new way. This is why modern humans can appear so powerful and so brittle at once. They inherit both sides of the old transformation. They inherit flexibility, cumulative knowledge, patience, cooperation, and the ability to organize delayed reward at massive scale. They also inherit dependence on systems that feel permanent until they are not. The hidden cost of ancient success never truly vanished. It expanded with the scale of human achievement. This may be the deepest legacy of all, not a tool, not a migration, not a single invention, but a permanent behavioral posture toward the future. Humans became the species that lives ahead of itself. The species that stores, predicts, rehearses, worries, and remembers. The species that does not simply inhabit conditions but tries constantly to get in front of them. That posture can produce brilliance. It can also produce chronic fear over building rigid authority and a tragic inability to notice when old protections have become new dangers. The ancient unseen change may therefore survive not only in our strengths, but in our blind spots. And the blind spot is familiar. People still struggle to notice slow change while it is happening. They respond better to visible crises than to gradual transformations. They mistake temporary success for durable stability. They rely on inherited patterns because those patterns once worked, even when signs are accumulating that the ground has shifted again. In that sense, modern humans may be repeating the oldest part of the story. The one thing we never noticed did not stop with our ancestors. It remains difficult for us to see in ourselves. What survives in the record suggests that our predecessors were not fools wandering blindly into change. They were intelligent, observant, adaptive people, doing their best within timescales no single life could grasp. That is uncomfortably close to the present. We too live inside systems larger than perception, slower than instinct, and powerful enough to reorganize behavior without asking permission. We too absorb background change as inconvenience first, then adjustment, then routine, then identity. We too may be mistaking adaptation for understanding. So the legacy of the ancient hidden shift is not just that it helped make civilization possible. It is that it may still define the way civilization feels from the inside. The restlessness, the attachment to forecasts, the reverence for memory systems, the fear of disruption, the love of stored abundance, the moral weight placed on patience, preparedness, and self-control. The recurring fantasy that if enough information is gathered and enough order imposed, uncertainty can finally be contained. These are not random features of modern life. They may be the deep habits of a species educated by unstable worlds, and there is something sobering in that realization. It means human nature may be less timeless than it appears, shaped not only by genes or abstract reason, but by ancient environmental pressures repeated so long they became normal. The mind that feels natural to us may itself be a historical artifact, or at least partly so. If that is true, then the most powerful changes in human history are not always the ones commemorated with monuments or remembered in names. Sometimes they are the ones that disappear so completely into behavior that later people call them simply the way we are. That is where the mystery ends, or rather where it turns back toward us. A slow, nearly invisible change begins in the background of ancient life. It erodes certainty. Humans answer by remembering harder planning, longer, waiting better, sharing more carefully, and building systems to protect themselves against futures they cannot fully know. Those systems become culture. Culture becomes civilization. Civilization becomes the modern world. And the ancient lesson remains hidden inside all of it, still shaping decisions, still guiding fear, still rewarding preparation, still punishing complacency. The one thing humans never noticed may have changed everything precisely because once it entered behavior deeply enough, it no longer needed to be noticed at all. The land is quiet again at the end of a story like this. Not empty, never empty, but quiet in the way old landscapes are quiet when they have outlived the people who once trusted them. A dry basin where water once held longer. A drowned shelf beneath a modern sea. A valley crossed so many times that no footprints remain, only the logic of return buried in stone and bone. Somewhere long ago, a group pauses beside a fire and makes one more small adjustment to a world that has become slightly less reliable than memory says it should be. They do not know they are changing history. They do not know they are changing themselves. They are only trying to survive the season. That is perhaps the most humbling part. Human transformation does not always arrive through grand intention. Often it comes through repetition under pressure, through the patient accumulation of practical choices, through the slow bending of habit around conditions no one fully understands while living inside them. A species learns to wait, to store, to teach, to trust certain people, to fear certain absences, to build security out of memory. And over enough generations, those choices become so ordinary that they seem to belong to human nature itself. The ruins of later civilizations make this easy to forget. They draw the eye toward kings and walls and droughts and collapses dramatic enough to name. But beneath those visible endings lies a much older continuity, the long effort to make life stable in a world that never stays still for very long. This same wind moves over grassland, over ruined stone, over fields, over roads, over modern cities. The same uncertainty waits behind every system that feels permanent. The same human instinct reaches forward into tomorrow, trying to soften what tomorrow might bring. And perhaps that is the final image that lingers. Not disaster, not triumph, but a fire watched carefully in the dark. Hands preserving it because warmth will matter later. Food turning slowly because hunger must be answered before it becomes desperate. Children nearby learning without realizing it what kind of world they belong to. Beyond the circle of light, the landscape is already changing. Inside the circle, human beings are already changing with it.